Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Apostolos Magiriadis, and we shall start with the last session in this cycle on foreign affairs, but the Greek foreign affairs towards international and regional uncertainties. We're waiting for the last people to come, be seated, to start our discussion with Mrs. Alexandra Papadopoulou, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mrs. Papadopoulou, who has a long mandate in the diplomatic corps of Greece. I remind you that she was the ambassador of Greece in the USA and, of course, the director of the diplomatic office of the Prime Minister, Mr. Kyriakos Mitsotakis. I will not elaborate on your CV. I think it is accessible to all online. What is the most important thing is that Ms. Papadopoulou quite rarely goes in public, so we shall seize this opportunity to talk about Greek foreign policy in a very difficult era with continuous challenges, and in an era that today we are having a month after the invasion of Hamas to Israel. Many things to say, Ms. Papadopoulou. Hello, and thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you back. There is this infamous theory of Nassim Taleb of the Black Swan saying that the future is full of continuous linear development unless something goes up, a black swan, an unpredictable event that changes the course of things. And of course, it has very asymmetrical consequences for things as we have been waiting for them. A question here, first question, is whether crisis in the Middle East right now was a black swan or not, if one could predict that or not, and exactly what this might mean, this crisis about Greece and Greek foreign policy. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I would like to thank the cycle and the President, Mr. Venizelos, because you have created this forum. Even if when I was in the USA, I have been close to you over the internet. When we are having such an analysis, I don't want us to limit ourselves in what is going on in the Middle East, because what's going on during the last month in the Middle East was not incidental and is not independent, or they cannot be interpreted outside what's happening around us in the world. We're living a very specific global conjuncture, a transitional historic period in which there are many changes all over the world. And we do not know what will be the form of the global architecture safety-wise 5 or 10 years later. In this framework, of course, it has been a traumatic incident, the attack of Hamas against Israel, regardless of how harsh, bloody, and traumatic has it been. Nobody could challenge the fact that the situation in the Middle East was like a boiling pot. This cannot justify what happened in October 7th, but the situation in the Middle East should be seen under the framework of development, through the framework of dreams and aspirations that were left unmet, or fears that indeed were proven to be true, even if some players perceive them as quite excessive. The Abraham Agreement paved the way for the territory, but at the same time brought an approach that all problems in the Middle East can be solved through the agreement between Israel and significant Arab countries. Of course, the problems in the Middle East go through that approach, but the Palestinian cause is lying at the basis of this big unsafety and risks that exist in the territory. So then it was brought again into surface. If we need to examine overall what's going on in the Middle East, we have to examine some shortages in the foreign affairs of the USA, meaning that at the end of the Trump administration, but also during the Biden administration, for reasons related to the issue of China, the administration of the USA, regardless of the political party, believes that the first, the absolute, and the only, the most important issue is the management of China. Then all other topics were left aside. Having said that, there was an impression, either good or bad, that it can retrieve from the Middle East, leaving many forces behind, many negative forces and forces of reversal, to create a suffocating condition, the result of which can be seen today. The terror attack of Hamas was the trigger in a very difficult conjunction, a very difficult neighborhood, and the impact can be seen tonight and will be seen for quite some time ahead. If I may interpret what you have just said, I understand that for your analysis, it might have been a black swan for the Americans or for the administration, what happened in the Middle East, but not for all the others that were able to see where things were heading. I do not think that the Americans were not aware of the risk, but they are evaluating the different priorities in their foreign policy. They have significant internal problems, and they have ended up with a perception that they cannot be the policeman of the world. To them, China is the most important issue, and everything else comes second. But the Middle East was not their awakening. It was the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. They started to see that things were not as they believed, and of course we had the Middle East issue. Now, the Greek-Turkish dialogue, where you are the head, through the institutional scheme chosen, is it independent from what's going on in the Middle East? And do you believe that it can lead to a derailment right now? Nothing is independent in this world, and of course, two countries that are neighboring. I can read many different analyses that the crisis in the Middle East will affect the Greek-Turkish dialogue, but I believe that it will be affected positively, because both Greece and Turkey, regardless from the different views, the different approaches, the different objectives, the different credos that they might have, they have one common interest. They cannot live in an area that is explosive. And the explosion in the Middle East is about us. It's about both of us. Both of us have an interest for not extending that crisis beyond the Middle East. And thus, I do believe that, having said that, it is ancillary in the efforts of the two administrations to have smooth waters in these relationships. On December 7th, in 1 month's time, there will be the meeting between the two countries, Thessaloniki. What are we waiting from that? Some news about the migration, an agreement perhaps that could mitigate our concerns in this field, any development in the remaining open fields? The Greek-Turkish dialogue is a procedure that will not be fruitful within 1 day's time. Only the fact that this meeting will take place, very important, the High Council of Cooperation will convene. It is very positive. The fact that ministers from both countries will sit around the same table to discuss about common challenges, such as the migration crisis, because the migration is a common challenge. We might see that there is this migration flow coming from the Turkish borders, but Turkey has another migration problem in another format. So it is a common challenge, and the conditions in the Middle East do create risks for an explosion of the migration problems, which is about all the Mediterranean bases. A common challenge is migration, natural disasters, climate change. We do have many common horizontal issues that should be tackled jointly, because when climate changes, this will change in all ways, north, south, east, west. It is positive that we can discuss about it. You know, nobody should believe that tomorrow morning both countries will wake up and all problems will be solved. Even with Italy, that will have the closest possible relationship in the framework of NATO or the EU, there are problems. We're discussing about them. Nobody understands that, and this is quite right, because these problems are not related to a daily routine, but this is affected, and we can have the chance to solve the problem. So the meetings between Greeks and Turks, as said by the Prime Minister, should not be any news. Quite right. Let me insist on that. There was the meeting, this dialogue started. I understand that obviously you cannot reveal the content of this discussion, but what you see from the other side is that you would expect or not. It was a very positive meeting. The Turks' interlocutors came into this meeting having the goodwill, and they were quite aware of the fact that relationships should follow shallow waters, and this is a positive thing. Okay, I understand. And let me come to the end of this sub-chapter on Thessaloniki and the migration. If I understood you well, the crisis in the Middle East might give birth to a new migration crisis, and I understand that you work in this scenario. This is one of the fears for all Mediterranean countries, and above all Greece, which is quite close. Of course, when you have such a wide crisis, because you know what, we can see the preposterous images from Gaza and the equally preposterous images from the attack on October 7th, but this crisis affects the Arab governments, mainly of mild countries and moderate countries like Egypt, for instance. And there was the turmoil and there were volatile conditions in these countries. All of us, we do have an agony because this situation might derail and there can be migration flows. Greece is the first objective, first target, because we're nearby. But this also pertains to the EU, not just the frontliners, but again, the countries that are in the background have the same agony. This is a topic that can be discussed not just with Turkey, but also with the Italians throughout the European councils. We can discuss about it because this era is difficult. Quite clear. Now, this crisis, do you believe that this crisis can lead us to something else? We cannot predict the end. But can it be an accelerator of developments for a closer cooperation in the fields of energy in our basin in the southeastern Mediterranean? Well, right now, as long as there is a clash, I think that this is an obstacle because we see that Israel has stopped all exports of energy resources, using energy for own purposes. These quite useful projects for trade corridors through the Gulf of Israel, Greece, and Cyprus will be inhibited. There is a turmoil which is not to the benefit of a smooth flow of things until all clash stops. In this cycle of ideas, I would say that the challenge is to communicate between panels. Shortly ago, in the panel that Mrs. Nikoltsiou, we discussed about the scenario of the America's role in the world being and the perspective of a Trump administration again. You know, the US, you were the head of the Greek diplomacy there for quite some time. How can we be ready as Europe to welcome such a scenario? And what can we see in a second Trump administration, if this is the case, of course, regardless from our view on Trump? And regardless from the policy and the judicial cases, we must look behind the Trump's facade. In 2016, Trump expressed something that is quite alive and quite different from what it was in 2016. In the US, there is a certain mobility in terms of demographic, in terms of culture, society, in politics, in economics, put it as you like. So all these tectonic changes that are taking place in a huge country like the USA, of course, have an impact on the electorate. So, independent from the new president, name it Trump or as you want, this reality cannot be ignored. Now, when it comes to what Trump will do, I saw some polls in the 5 critical states. He's ahead of Biden. So, looking into the internal affairs in the USA, Trump has some judicial affairs, of course, but there is President Biden who has a certain image that may create some concerns amongst the electorate and, of course, in the Democratic Party. This is an issue that can be solved in due course. America is a big democracy, it's a big republic, and has some reserves of forces. We saw that besides throughout the events that took place on January 6th. What we must pay attention to is what's going on regardless from people, and it's quite deep. It is in America quite different if you only see the demographics, how they've changed in the country, because indeed there is a problem of racial imbalance, but the bigger problem is a social one right now. We could discuss about it for quite some time, and you're right. Nevertheless, having an American crisis, having China, that continuously is increasing influence. There is Europe in between, with two wars in its borders, Ukraine and the Middle East. So is it high time for a violent adulthood of Europe, for a more powerful military and diplomatic footprint? President Macron tomorrow will convene the conference on humanitarian aid. This is quite welcome, but the question is, can we reach a point that Europe will have a more powerful role? Well, adulthood of Europe is a dream of all people in my generation. We are protesting in Athens in favor of the European idea and European integration. The European dream did not move as quickly as my generation would have wanted, but this does not mean that it didn't move even a bit. The good things with Europe is that it accelerates and evolves in spite of all crises. This crisis, which is of course Ukraine, the Caucasus region, of course, the Balkans that have not been stabilized 20 years after Thessaloniki. It's the change in how we work. It's the change in productive models. It's about internal social imbalances. And we said about America, there are also imbalances in Europe. Out of all that, we have many crises that Europe should tackle. And if there's a problem in tackling that in the US, which is one country with a central system in spite of the federation, it's even harder to do that in Europe because each country has its own challenges to face. You will never hear me saying that I don't believe that Europe will not make it. No, I'm a pro-European. But I'm not blind either, because there are challenges, there are difficulties ahead, and practically there are difficulties in this endeavor. President Macron has talked about a defensive adulthood of Europe, which is very important, quite difficult though. Let's start from what's simple, that is, Europe should stand in its foot when it comes to the natural resources, raw material. That is, in other words, it can be self-sufficient in order to be on its own one factor of importance. The problem with Europe is that never until now did it make it for its big financial might and its charm as a continent of ideas and heritage. This was not materialized. Soft power never turned into hard power, perhaps because we never wanted that. Perhaps because we believe that this era has come to the end and soft power would suffice. This era proves that possibly we were wrong in that, and possibly this is our opportunity so that we can replace the lost time. One thing is certain, and regardless of different views within the EU, we all agree that if we survive, we will survive all together. It's clear. From tomorrow's meeting in Paris, can we wait something as a country? Are there some proposals to table, something to wait from the Prime Minister? From day one, we said that we cannot cover the needs of 2.5 million Palestinians living in Gaza, and regardless of the war clashes, there is the human rights to respect, of course the right of Israel to self-defense, of course the conviction of Hamas and of terror, but at the same time the need of 2.5 million people who have the right to live. So Greece is the protagonist in these efforts for this humanitarian aid to reach Gaza. We have sent a national body. The humanitarian aid goes through borders, through shore, through land borders, through Egypt, because a boat cannot even approach Gaza. There's no infrastructure, there's nothing there, but whatever is needed, Greece will always be the hero of that. In our 2 minutes remaining, let me ask you about the role of Greece in the Balkan region, because we see that there is Turkey and it wants to play a role in the Middle East, and the importance that is given by some people. What are we doing about the Balkans? We're 20 years after Thessaloniki, after the infamous summit. Not many things have taken place in this field. What can we do to put pressure on that and accelerate the procedure? For the last 20 years, which is about the US and the EU, in the Balkans, there has been a game of soft hard power. All local bodies of hard power won, and not the EU or international bodies of soft power. But now it's a time of truth. For Greece, the European integration of the Balkans is a red line. Of course, we do support the European perspective of Ukraine and Moldova, of course, but not to the detriment of the Western Balkans, because they might not have reached the level we would have wanted, the level of integration and the level of reforms, but nevertheless, for 20 years they have been trying, with pros and cons, of course. For sure, the enlargement is an issue of what everybody has done, and they will be judged on performance. But for Greece, we cannot accept that these countries will be left behind. Europe cannot have a black hole, and we cannot turn a blind eye on that, because we're always there. Greece has come through different phases. We have always been active. Then, due to the financial crisis, we retrieved. Then we're back. And Greece, no matter where we went, there was a soft power, because we are fully aware of the fact that we cannot be hard power, but also as human people, human beings, as talents, we're closer to soft power, as culture as well. Yes, as culture as well. And we've seen that everywhere in the world. That's why we are welcomed, and they want us. They have no negative feelings against us. This is quite important. Thank you so much for the discussion. Thank you, Ms. Papadopoulou. I think that this is a lesson of foreign policy within 20 minutes' time. And to reply to the channel of Ms. Nicolcho, there was news, and journalists will write many articles based on that. Thank you so much for being here. I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Πηγαίνουμε στο
So we will proceed with the second panel.
We now go to our panel discussion with Professor Soli Ozel, who is a senior lecturer at the Istanbul Kadir Has University, and Professor Lukas Tsoukalis, the president of LIAMEP, and a professor at the Sciences Po in Paris. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. And we look forward to a very fruitful discussion. Professor Ozel, I'll start with you. For the moment you're settled and you drink your water. So we just had a discussion on how the Middle East crisis is changing the whole environment in the Middle East and our neighborhood. I am going to repeat this question to our panel, and I'm waiting for your own take. And I want you to emphasize a little bit on how do you see Turkey's role on this crisis. Turkey is a member of NATO. It's somehow taking side in favor of Hamas. And I would like to ask you whether you sense that it's putting in question its intermediary role in the current crisis.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. Now, this is one of those times when it's better not to make any predictions about the future, right? Quite frankly, I don't know exactly how this will all play out. There is a lot of things that have been shattered, in my judgment, in the way particularly the Western world reacted to what had gone on, with lots of incriminations and fissures in societies about positions that are taken. As for Turkey, At first, President Erdogan took a very calm and measured position, response. Then he felt the pressure from his Islamist right wing. That explains, in my view, to a large extent, the speech last Wednesday, followed by the speech at the rally right before the centennial of the Republic. And it was not, I don't think, a coincidence that that rally had to take place on the 28th, right on the eve of the Republic's 100th anniversary. Since then, he did step back. On his way back from Kazakhstan, he still said that he was not going to, that Bibi Netanyahu, he dismisses, you know, as Greeks, you know, some people don't exist, and then they do. I don't think he will meet Bibi again. And they were supposed to have actually a meeting in Istanbul in December. That's what they decided, that they agreed upon in September when they met at on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meetings. And of course, he said it was not in anyone's mind to actually break relations with Israel. The Israelis withdrew their ambassador. Turkey withdrew its ambassador, but I think the underlings are still working. Whether or not this does anything to Turkey's desire to become a mediator, it probably does. On the other hand, if all the rumors are correct, that we will end up with a transfer of population, and that's the nice word to use, it's ethnic cleansing, actually, of Gaza, for a population, by the way, whose parents and grandparents have been ethnically cleansed, Turkey will be one of the destinations. I don't know how he will sell it to the public, but that, I think, is what we are likely to see. In that sense, Turkey will continue to be a player, but I don't think it will play the same role as Qatar and Egypt. Final point. Before the hospital bombing, which then, of course, radicalized the Turkish public as well, Turkey was deeply involved in hostage release negotiations, and those who were in those negotiations really felt confident that at least for half the hostages they were going to get somewhere, but for the moment I don't think anything is happening.
So that means, just to clarify, that you sense that both Qatar and Egypt will have an upgraded role in the whole crisis?
Egypt, by definition, will, and Qatar has already done so. Didn't that? I mean, all the hostages released so far have been released because Qatar intervened. Now, Qatar's role is always a very duplicitous role. Some people actually want Qatar to be totally out of these things, but you can't. I mean, Qatar has been the financier of Gaza Hamas with full knowledge of Israeli Prime Minister. I mean, all those things are going to be discussed when this mess is over. That's why I really don't know exactly how things are going to proceed, because what appears today or what seems to be in place today may not be once the dust settles.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Tsoukalis, on your side, you recently wrote a Tanea newspaper on Saturday. The Middle East crisis is a larger threat to world peace and world economy compared to the Ukrainian front. Could you elaborate a little bit on this?
Well, let us start with the beginning, as they say. It is true that we live in times of transition. The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting in a big way. There is strategic rivalry between the US and China. Russia has resorted to arms to challenge the post-Cold War order as shaped by those who had won the Cold War. Now we have a new war in the Middle East, and we have the former undisputed superpower, namely the United States, which is facing not only a growing challenge from China, but an even bigger challenge from inside, because it is a country with a deeply polarized and increasingly gridlocked political system, which makes the United States possibly or increasingly unpredictable in its foreign policy. It's very difficult to predict what US foreign policy is going to be like 2 years from now, especially given the big question mark of the presidential elections next year. So that is the context. Now we have a new war. I believe that this war between Hamas and Israel, or if you want the wider context, between Israel and the Palestinians, or the even wider context between Israel and a large part of Arab societies. Now, that is dangerous, not only because there's so many outside powers involved who may want to take advantage of it, but also because there are several non-state actors. I mean, in the war in Ukraine, there's a certain degree of predictability, even with Putin. Non-state organizations in the Middle East are less predictable as actors in the game, and that's why I'm deeply worried. And the other thing I'm deeply worried about is that if bombing continues, the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza increases by the day. And if we end up with what Soli referred to as ethnic cleansing or forced removal of Palestinians from Gaza, then the anger in the Arab street and the wider Muslim world will multiply. And the big risk, the way I would put it, is the West against the rest. And that is not a confrontation that none of us wants to face.
And when you say the rest, I assume you also include China, you assume you include all those
and the global
powers.
South. I mean, look at the response. Today, the West, with the United States as a leader, seems to be increasingly identified with Israel. Of course, everybody, every normal human being should condemn the butchery on the 7th of October. But nobody should also be allowed to forget the wider context. Nobody should be allowed to forget that there are millions of Palestinians who live under occupation or in the open prison of Gaza. That does not justify what Hamas did, but it helps you to explain why the Palestinian society is producing a large number of people who are prepared to resort to arms to challenge what they consider to be an unbearable situation.
Thank you, Professor Tsoukalis. Let's shift the discussion a little bit from the broader context to our side, to the Aegean Sea. Professor Zell, do you sense I asked the alternate minister, Papadopoulou, a while ago on whether she senses that the crisis in the Middle East might affect the Greek-Turkish rapprochement. And I repeat this question here to you on the sense on whether you find that the different stances that both governments are taking might affect their dialogue.
Mr. Mangeriadis, before I get to that, neither of us mentioned one word. That's Iran.
Oh, sure.
Everything revolves around Iran. If we're going to talk about the geopolitics of the Middle East, we cannot dismiss the presence of Iran and Iran's links to what Professor Tsoukalis identified to non-state actors. All of them survive or all of them prosper because of Iran's material or training help. And that will be shaping, that has already been shaping the new configurations in the Middle East, and it will continue to do so. On China, on the one hand, China wins. The West debilitates itself in Ukraine and in Gaza, both prestige-wise and in terms of its supplies. And the Chinese are going to be inheriting the Russian Empire as their vassal. On the other hand, when you look at it, even if they're going to benefit from what goes on in the Middle East, the Chinese are never, ever doing anything constructive. And if there's going to be a new that will be built, it cannot just be built on being not America and then appealing to the rest of the world as such.
Well, sorry, they engineered the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is extraordinary.
No, they did not engineer it. I think they ultimately brokered it, and I think it was the Saudis who wanted them to be there in order to send a message to the United States. I mean, how many of you in this room 5 years ago would have guessed that the ruler of Saudi Arabia would not take phone calls from the President of the United States? I mean, one may or may not like MBS. Do not underestimate his strategic moves. In my judgment. This conflict, in due time, will have one impact, and I want to second what you said. I think it will be open season on individual or organized terrorism in the Western world, particularly, I would suspect, against Jewish communities. And second,
you mean in Europe and in
Europe, Americas, and or wherever they're present. And second, far more at least for me, far more seriously, this war may end up giving us a second Trump term, and that is really not personally something that I would wish.
And that is because of the stance that Biden takes on the current crisis?
The man put trillions of dollars in America's pockets. Unemployment rate was down to 3.2%, and Biden's popularity was at 42%. Please explain, okay? And now, with this war, he has lost the younger generations and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is now even a more divided party.
And the Muslim part.
And the Muslim part, yes.
Okay.
And the blacks are also leaving the party. Whereas the Republican Party fears Trump more than it fears God, okay? So he will be the candidate. And what does that say about a country where somebody who actually tried to stage a coup cannot actually be prevented from being in politics? What does that say about America as a state? In my judgment, is something that political scientists will have to ponder, and it's not good news. So on Eastern Mediterranean, everything will be on hold. We don't really have much of a conflict. Once the dust settles, I think things are just going to continue as they are. It was important that Hezbollah's leader basically said we're not going to get involved, at least not immediately. It was important that the Americans sent the ships, but also said, we know that the Iranians are not in on it. I don't know whether they were or not, but that was a message that we don't want to bring you in. Don't try. And the Iranians obviously are not interested. So the leadership of the Arab world may be happy if Hamas is destroyed, but they will have to deal with their populations. Then we'll pick up the pieces after we know exactly what happens in Gaza.
Professor Tsoukalis, any follow-ups on the question about the Greek-Turkish dialogue?
Yes, first reaction would be that I would tend to agree with what I heard from Minister Papadopoulou, that in the short term at least, the war in the Middle East may even promote Greek-Turkish dialogue because both sides want peaceful coexistence. I mean, we've got enough trouble in the area. We don't want more trouble in the Aegean. Okay, so still waters is likely to continue. In the medium term, it becomes more difficult. And I know, and I fully agree with Soli, that it's always dangerous to predict the future, even now, even more so nowadays. But think of a possible scenario which says, what I mentioned before, an increasing confrontation that takes the form of West against the rest. Then Turkey will have to take sides. And if Turkey is increasingly pushed in taking a side with the rest, then, of course, relations with the West will become much more complicated. None of us, both Greeks, Americans, and others, want Turkey to leave the West. It is not in anybody's interest for this to happen. But if this is the tendency, then this is bound to have implications, and not necessarily positive implications, on relations with Greece. But for Turkey, relations with Greece is not the first priority, not even the second priority. I mean, if you look at the map, you understand why. You don't need to explain further. So my position would be, despite the terrible situation happening there, this may have a positive impact on Greek-Turkish relations, but I'm not sure how long this would last if the situation deteriorates.
Point taken. Yeah.
Who is the rest?
The rest?
Who is the rest? India has any problems with what Israel is doing?
No. But the rest is China, Russia, and a
Is
large
China
part of the
having a
global south.
Is China having a problem with what Israel is doing? It's benefiting from
It's
it.
benefiting.
But
Okay,
it's
so
not-
it will take advantage. It
Yeah,
will
fine,
take
but
advantage. I mean, look
I'm
also
really
the
one.
UN. Look at the UN.
No,
resolution.
but look, that is because the West itself, starting with the United States, destroyed the so-called rules-based order in 2003, and it blocked the institutions. So the institutions don't work, and because China and the United States cannot see eye to eye, there is no effort to see how to rebuild them. But when we talk about, I mean, I know the global South issue. It will be to the detriment of the West, all those things that are happening. We've seen it in Ukraine. We're seeing it in Gaza, the double talk, hypocrisy. But if you look at it geopolitically, Israel has incredibly good relations with a lot of the African countries. Are going to be directed more to the West because of its double standard, or to Israel in the long? I don't know.
It will be more difficult.
Yeah,
I think.
but
It will be more
if two potential leaders of the rest are India and China, I really see nothing in them that would be terribly disturbed by what Israel does. In fact, this also justifies their quote-unquote war on terror. The Modi would be very happy if he could destroy all his Muslims in India, and the Chinese are doing so to the Turkish Muslims in Xinjiang anyway.
But it certainly gives negotiating power and the capacity to the
Fine.
Chinese to take advantage.
Okay.
And they will, wouldn't you, if you were in their position?
Fine, but that is building power on the basis of not being something, not being America. What are the Chinese going to offer to the world is a different question, and there I don't know.
Of course.
You just realized that those two people don't need a moderator, right?
No, it's because
Thank
of
you
our
for that.
moderator that we can speak.
Thank
this
you.
way.
I welcome that. That's great. Just a clarification, Professor Tsoukalis. When we're talking about the war between the West and the rest, this is a new Cold War you're
I
describing?
didn't talk about war.
Right. A
The-
fight.
The West is increasingly being accused by a large part of the global South of hypocrisy and double standards. And that applies when you compare to the Western attitude towards Ukraine and the war in Ukraine,
Exactly.
and what is happening now in Gaza. But it is also true that the West suffers. I mean, there is an additional problem, if I may add, talking about the Middle East. Israeli settlements in Palestine have been expanding constantly and at an accelerating pace under the Netanyahu rule. Violence against the Palestinians has also been growing on the Western Bank. American criticism of that is usually in a statement and nothing happens. And when it comes to, they are concerned, and when it comes to the United Nations, the US will always use its veto to protect Israel. Now, this message is clear and loud to other countries. So the moral superiority of the West is increasingly in doubt. This is what I'm saying.
Right.
And that has implications for foreign policy.
Let's take advantage of the fact that you also take some time in Paris and you teach at Sciences Po. Tomorrow there's a conference in Paris about humanitarian aid. Is there a diplomatic space for diplomatic, political, military, you name it, space for Europe during this Middle Eastern crisis. What do you sense that there is any outcome for Brussels, for Paris, for Berlin, any space for maneuver over the next, months?
Yeah, as
on
you
this-
know,
on this
I
crisis?
published a book last year entitled Europe's Coming of Age. And it was partly analysis and partly a call for Europe becoming a political adult. And I'm deeply convinced that unless Europe makes the transition to political adulthood, which should include adding hard power to our soft power, parenthesis, I mean, the persuasive effect of European Venus is limited in times when there is war all over the place, okay? So, and now with Ukraine and the Middle East, this argument is reinforced. But at the same time, every time there is a crisis in the Middle East, we keep on being reminded how impotent Europe is. Europe is essentially non-existent in the Middle East, and that's not only because we don't have hard power, it's also because we are divided. I mean, look at what has been happening. We spent fighting about words in communiques that hardly anybody will pay attention to, if I may put it very bluntly.
Please do.
And this is frustrating if you are a convinced European, which I am.
Any space for Greece or Turkey or Cyprus in the current crisis? Is
Well, we
Greece in a
may-
position to influence the Arab world like it used to, the Arab countries like it used to back in the 80s or the 90s?
I think that we should use our role as much as we can, but it is limited influence. Let us be clear and realistic. And we will also be faced with very uncomfortable choices in the days, weeks, and months to come. I mean, suppose this continues, and suppose there is mass exodus, forced mass exodus of Palestinians. What will Greece say?
Professor Zel, we're talking about the a vast exodus of Palestinians. Could we say numbers? Could we estimate what we're talking about here?
I mean,
And how easy would it be for Turkey or other countries to somehow, accommodate this whole
I really have
exodus?
no idea. We're not there. We're not there yet. Meaning there, we don't yet have an atmosphere in the world whereby the forced transfer of Palestinians or forced expulsion of Palestinians is an acceptable outcome of this thing. The Egyptians resist opening the Rafah border because the last 75 years of history, that is since the foundation of the State of Israel, tell us or give us one very certain message. If you leave your place, you cannot return, all right? But what I'm thinking is, if there were 1 million people in the north, I heard in the news yesterday that 600,000 already moved south, but 400,000 remained in place. Maybe they will empty the north, and then you really cannot have 2 million people living in the south. It was already much more condensed than any other place in the world. And then there will be an argument that maybe 2 million people, 2.5 million people cannot live in the south. Maybe some of them ought to be going to other places. Will they want to? Is it feasible? Can countries accept such numbers in hundreds of thousands? Those are all big questions. And this will all be done so that Israeli security is secured by emptying Gaza. The morality of that is also going to be a terrible thing, and I really don't know how any European country can actually support or defend that position and then claim that Europe stands for this, that, and the other. It's incredibly difficult. It's an entanglement, and it's much bigger than Cyprus or Greece or even Turkey or any single country. It just is. So my only hope, and I don't know if you would concur, Biden and Xi apparently are going to meet in about 10 days. And perhaps they will take stock of the danger that this situation presents, and actually that becomes part of their agenda as well. I don't know.
I mean, I very much hope so. America needs to talk to China, and China needs to talk to America. And it is changing.
It is changing.
Encouraging that the initial reaction of the Biden administration is becoming more subtle, and they recognize the need for close contact and dialogue with the Chinese. This was not the case in the beginning.
No. Well, I mean, the fact that she will be there in San Francisco for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting is in.
So that means that there is some place for diplomacy, you sense?
Absolutely, there is room for diplomacy, assuming that we are prepared to take advantage of it. And the key players are able to take advantage of it. Now, I insist.
I'm saying that because we saw Blinken coming to the neighborhood, but no tangible results.
When it comes to the crunch, if the bombing continues, if there are more and more people killed, and then there is forced evacuation, and America may condemn it, but still will side with Israel, then it becomes very difficult. What kind of dialogue do you have then?
Even Hezbollah's words Nasrallah's words may not be forever, may not be valid forever. Because you see, what's the argument? Israel has a right to defend itself. Okay, we bomb and civilians are collateral damage, but after having bombed for, 20 days, then you must have gotten something, and if you have gotten something, then you should not be bombing as much anyway. So it will all become very convoluted, I would say, and sooner or later, at some point, the Americans will have to basically make another type of statement, which I'm not sure if they're capable of. And I must say, it's ad hominem perhaps, but Blinken just doesn't have the weight.
Oh, may I put it differently? Do you think that America can
restrain? Is it Blinken or is it Biden?
No.
Can restrain Netanyahu?
No.
Okay.
No, because Bibi Netanyahu has an interest in prolonging this as much as possible, so that he doesn't end up in jail or being hung like Mussolini from the tree.
Let me get back to what you said. Is it Blinken or is it Biden? Meaning that you mentioned, his gravitas, I would say.
His gravitas, I don't see any gravitas in him. It's Blinken. Look, the National Security Advisor of the United States of America says the Middle East has not been calmer than this in ages. A few days later, you have Hamas.
Okay.
Yeah, and please.
But they precisely wanted to make the point. I mean, that was the end of the Abraham negotiations.
Yeah, it was that. Yeah.
Okay, to wrap this up, in the minute and a half we also have, could we have like an assessment for the good case scenario and the bad case scenario in front of us over the next month?
I yield to the professor.
Sorry, that's very kind of you. Okay, my problem is that it's very difficult to see what kind of good scenario one can construct. It's extremely difficult to imagine a negotiated solution which is not at the expense of thousands of people dying. And that's what makes me very worried. And if you add also the personal factor that mentioned by Soli Özel, namely Netanyahu's role, which is crucial in the whole thing, then, and also the fact, he mentioned the gravitas of an individual. I don't know, I have no comment on that. But history tells us that when it comes to the crunch, the United States has been always find it extremely difficult to restrain Israeli leadership, okay? For a variety of reasons that many of us know. Now, given this situation and given the kind of prime minister Israel has now, I'm deeply worried.
Right.
Look, I don't think many of us can fully appreciate the trauma that 7th of October generated in Israel. I have relatives there, I have friends there. Most of them, as you can imagine, are peaceniks. But even peaceniks are shaken, and it will take some time to actually come back to their senses. For that, they need reassurances, and a lot of reassurances and all. I don't know how that can be generated under the circumstances. And I'm wondering, and this is my last thing, the only, if not the only, but one positive step perhaps, I'm wondering if MBS will be able to get his uncle's plan from 2002, dust it off, bring it and say, why don't we have a settlement? But I'm not sure that the Israeli public is ready to listen to a settlement. One big change though, before, on the 6th of October, the debate about this issue in the world was the two-state solution is dead, one-state moment which will evolve into a one-state solution. I think that moment is dead too. The resurrection, since you're Christians, you don't mind me saying so, resurrection of the two-state solution, but it will take such a long time to be able to actually lay the groundwork for it. It will, I don't know.
Thank you very much, Professor Özel, Professor Tsoukalis, for this very enlightening conversation. A personal thank you to President Venizelos, Simon Tsomokos, for the opportunity, and we pass to our next panel. Thank you very much, all.
Εμείς είμαστε οι τελευταίοι, όχι δεν είμαστε. Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello.
Can you all please take your seats so we can start? Mr. Meimaroglu.
Barkey, who is in the US and will be online with us. You can see him here.
Good evening. Και μαζί...
And with us we shall have from Israel Mr. Charitos, who is an adjunct lecturer at Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and he is going to give us a taste of what he knows until now, and he will feed our discussion. Hello, Mr. Charitos. Hello from Jerusalem. Here with us, I would like rather to welcome Mrs. Christine Fab. She is the chair in comparative politics at the European Institute School of Transnational Governance. Am I right? In Florence, Italy. And she has written interesting things about the Greek-Turkey relationships. You have dealt with that, and we shall discuss about it as well, because as you see, Turkey is involved and plays a critical role in what we are living now. Mrs. Inoa Fendul is with us as well. We know her. She is Executive Director of the Institute of International Relations of Pantheon University and former member of NATO's International Secretariat. Welcome and thank you.
We will have a brief discussion with Professor Barkey, about 15 minutes. We will put some questions to him, and obviously we will have a dialogue between us, and once we complete our discussion, we will also welcome any questions that you might want to put to our guests here tonight. Well, Professor Barkey, I don't know actually where to start from. We all know the latest news today. Let me brief you just a little bit on what we know a few minutes ago. We know that a senior Hamas leader, Mr. Moussa Mazurk, told the BBC that women, children, and civilians were exempt from Hamas's attacks, something which is in quite stark contrast to the wealth of evidence that Hamas has produced with men shooting unarmed adults and children in the Jewish settlements, October 7th. Now, Mr. Mazurk is subject to an asset freeze in the UK under the counter-terrorism regulations. He is the most senior member to speak to the BBC since 7th October, the atrocities there. He said that hostages cannot be freed while Israel was bombing Gaza. We will release them, but we need to stop the fighting, he said. And one of the questions which comes automatically, and we will put it to Professor, is how does this stop? Now, the top news story until now is that also that the Israel Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, says that Israel may have security responsibility for Gaza for indefinite period after war ends. And that is quite interesting as well. Let's just keep these few news item stories and ask you for a first comment on the current situation, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me. I actually wish I was with you there, but look, we should not necessarily pay that much attention to statements that come out from either side at this stage. And I think we need to look more strategically at what's going on and try to look at where this is going and then work backwards. And let me just say, you have obviously a short-term problem, i.e. how do we stop the war? But to do that, we also have to look at what the Israeli objectives are at the moment. And I would say there are two. One, of course, is to get the hostages out, but secondly, to really destroy Hamas. And they will do that. It seems to me that they have made that decision, and it's a decision that is not just Bibi Netanyahu's decision, but I think it's a national decision. So as you think forward, when we look at, let's say, I don't know, a month from now, let's say that the war is over, what will be the outcome? I think Hamas will be destroyed one way or the other. It may be that some of its leadership will leave, just like Arafat left in 1982 from Beirut with some of the fighters, but it will stop existing in Gaza. Two, there will be a reconstruction of Gaza that has to start, and it has to start very, very quickly. And three, and this is something that people kind of don't pay that much attention to, and that is that there's going to be enormous change in Israel. Bibi Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition is done. And there is no way they can survive this. Historically, we've seen in the past when, after 1973, for instance, there was a major change, even though in 73, the Israelis did manage to win the war. But so as you think forward, and if you say that Hamas will be destroyed, Bibi will be gone, and with the coalition that he represents, and there will be a big reconstruction effort, which will be much more serious than we've seen anything. So that's what we should focus on and kind of work on that basis.
Okay, before we go to the next step, the future, I would like to drag us a little bit backwards more and ask you, what sort of war are we actually experiencing at the moment? I'm putting this question because I read a recent article of yours which says that this war, the war with Hamas, is a far more dangerous rather threat to Israel than the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Now, why is that? And what sort of war are we witnessing right now?
Well, because it's in the article, the argument I make that the war is dangerous to Israel because of a combination of two factors. One is what we see, the bombing in Gaza, right? And let's face it, I mean, we all know that Hamas has created an infrastructure on the civilian, where civilians live, right? Whether it's hospitals, schools, etc. But it is also a combination with Bibi. Bibi is somebody who has become, shall we say, gently, very disliked around the world. He has no soft power at the moment. So that combination is essentially undermining the legitimacy of Israel. And that's something that the Israelis have to take seriously, which is why I think that at the end, he's going to be gone. But at the moment, what the Israelis will do, I suspect, is take control of northern Gaza and cleanse as much as possible, right? And one more thing that we should take into account. Remember, there are videos of what happened on October 7th that the Israelis have not released for two reasons. I think mostly because of the hostage families will be probably horrified if they saw it. Some journalists have seen it, and some officials have seen it, but when that's released, right? Hamas's is the statement that you cited that they only attacked non-civilians is going to be shown because the barbarism is going also to change the perception of what happened. Because people have forgotten what happened on October 7th and focusing on the bombing, rightfully so.
But so actually, colleagues of mine have been to the ambassador of Israel these last few days, and they were shown some of the videos from the killings at the kibbutz on October 7th, and most of them could not contain themselves. They were crying. It was a terrible thing they witnessed. They don't even want to talk about it. Now, Professor, Hamas obviously made a political statement when they invaded that area. And you also said very recently that you believe that Hamas has already won the political game in there. Why is that?
Because at the moment, what you're seeing is only Israeli bombing of the Palestinian areas in Gaza. So in terms of PR, right, they have won. But the other, what we don't know yet, right, is also once the war is over, there are going to be a lot of changes in the Middle East, and you have actors in the Middle East and outside the Middle East who will be spoilers, who will not want a resolution of the issue, because I think one of the outcomes that we will see, especially with Bibi gone, is another genuine, and this time a genuine attempt at resolution of this conflict. Because clearly, as also was said in the previous panel of yours, there is this problem has to be resolved one way or the other. And this notion that there would be no two-state solution, actually, we will see exactly the opposite. I think a two-state solution is now more on the table and will probably be realized, and in some ways, ironically, because of this Hamas attack. So there are too many moving parts, and we also have to be prepared, essentially, for the spoilers. The spoilers are clearly the Iranians, Hezbollah, the Russians, to some extent, the Turks, and we don't know how they will all act at this stage. But all I'm saying is we need to think forward. We need to prepare ourselves for all these things.
A few days after the war began, you wondered, amidst the terrible disaster, if it could prove to be an opportunity. For whom and how?
Look, I think, let's face it, look at it just from the Israeli perspective, and I know we're going to have somebody speaking from Israel too. I think this attack, as barbaric as it was, as it turned the Israelis so much against, shall we say, the Palestinians, etc., it's also a realization for them that this war cannot continue like this. This conflict cannot continue like this anymore. And that you need some resolution, because 5 years from now, something like this can happen again, or you can have Hezbollah engage in another war. So it is an opportunity now for everybody, and the Israelis, I think, the Israeli public, and from what we can tell from polls, etc., that the Israeli public really has turned against the Bibi government and its right-wing allies. So that's one opportunity. Second, I think the Arab countries also realize that harboring organizations like Hamas, right, that really have no allegiance to either the Palestinians, ironically, or to the Arab world, but have their own agenda, right, is very dangerous. Right? It's a danger to them as well. And clearly the rest of the world realizes the consequence of it. So I think there will be a major push to do something. And if Hamas is destroyed, let's say, physically, politically, it might not be destroyed that easily, but that will open up a space, essentially, to start really working. But you really have to start working on it now. And we talked, your earlier panel talked about Xi and Biden getting together. But I think this has to come from Europe and the United States, and it has to be, there has to be really very concrete proposal put on the table. And look, I'm in a way optimistic, ironically, that something positive may come out of this. And usually, historically speaking, when you've had disasters always forces people to rethink things. 1973 ultimately led to Camp David. I mean, so it wasn't all lost in a way, if you think.
So how do you reckon this could end?
Well, so my guess is that the Israelis are now focused on the northern part of Gaza, and they will essentially control most of the northern Gaza and go after the tunnels and etc. And once they do that, you will see a ceasefire. And I don't know how long this will take. I have the Israelis are being very obscure, if you want, with plans, deliberately so. We don't know how many divisions of Israeli soldiers are in Gaza at the moment. We have very little information, and they're not making their plans public. So, but logic tells me that that's what they will want to do. And then at that point, once they've achieved a concrete objective, the problem for them is the hostages. I mean, the hostage issue is really very dicey domestically. So I don't know how they will deal with that yet, and that to some extent depends also on pressure that the Egyptians, the Qataris, and the rest of the world will put on Hamas.
Professor, obviously Hamas knew very well what they were doing. Right. Maybe they actually planned it and wanted it to happen. Was there, or is there a different way that Israel could have reacted? And which is this different way? We're witnessing the loss of thousands of lives of civilians who are not involved in war. Many of them are children, and this tide is turning against the Israeli plight. Whereas right from the beginning, I don't think there was any decent human being that would say it was well done on part from Hamas. So what other way could Israel have possibly reacted to that event?
Look, I've tried to think a great deal about that. First of all, you have to understand that Bibi had to react the way he did, because at this stage, he's no longer trying to fight to stay out of prison. He's trying to essentially fight for being put in the dustbin of history as one of Israel's worst leaders. So he wants to show that he can. So his initial reaction obviously was a military one. But it seems to me that just as they were not prepared for the Hamas attack, I don't think they had a plan for the military operation either. So they had to develop it over time. I don't know I don't know exactly what it is now, but so force majeure, I think he decided he had to do a military. What could he have done? He could have essentially launched an ultimatum and said to the rest of the world, you have, I don't know, 48 hours for the hostages to be released, and then for the leaders of Hamas and to be brought into justice. Something political rather than military, and say, look, you have 48 hours, you don't do it, we're going in. And I think that would have been a much better strategy, even though you know very well that Hamas would not have released the hostages, and Hamas would not have obviously given up its leadership, and therefore there would have been a war anyway. And that, in a paradoxical way, may have given Israelis a little bit more time to prepare for the military operation. And we see that military operations are messy in civilian areas. I mean, you can't avoid that.
And what's your view, finally, from the United States? Has Washington reacted as you expected? What about Blinken's shuttle diplomacy? Will that bring any results?
Well, let me say, first of all, that President Biden's reaction was probably the best any president could have come up with. What do I mean by that? He immediately sent 2 carrier groups to the region, right? And what that basically did was to prevent Hezbollah and Iran from expanding this. it could have been quite possible. It would have been possible for Hezbollah to also join the fight, right? Pushed by the Iranians. I mean, they are completely owned by the Iranian government. So, and Biden's decision to send those two carrier groups basically made it clear to the Iranians that there will be huge consequences for that. So at least we stopped that de-escalation. As for Blinken's shuttle diplomacy, look, at the end of the day, it's Biden who decides. And until Biden decides to put his weight down on this, I don't think things will move. So he has to decide what the next steps should be. And he may be waiting, I think, for another few days for the Israeli operation to end, that I mentioned earlier. And then he will push for a ceasefire.
Well, it seems that he gained quite a lot of points with his statement to Bibi, telling him, and I think it's the first time that this was ever voiced by a president of the United States, do not do the same mistakes that we did on September 11th. So that was a kind of an acknowledgement of the mistakes, the tragic mistakes that were carried out by Washington. So I think he has the upper hand, if I'm not mistaken.
Look, I think he has the upper hand, and also he has the upper hand because the Israeli public trusts him. The Israeli public probably trusts him more than they trust Bibi. So once he decides to come out, and of course it has to be done carefully, it has to be prepared, I think he will be able to sway. And I mean, I think, to be perfectly honest, the way to end this more quickly is to have a national unity government in Israel, to push Netanyahu out, and because that will provide the Israelis room, both politically and time-wise, and because the Israelis don't trust Netanyahu because of, he has his own interests. He was already very unpopular before this started, and now he's finished politically. So might as well get him out of the way.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Is there anybody from the panel first, who would like to put a question to Professor on what we have already listened? Anybody from the audience? We'll keep on talking. We'll keep our discussion live. And if you can still stay with us, you will be able to listen to the rest. Now, I guess we go to Israel right now, and we will welcome Mr. Haritos, who is also on the Skype and with us. Kalispera, κύριε Χαρίτο.
Good afternoon and hi. I will be speaking in Greek. We have interpretation, isn't it? Yes, of course we do. You told me something very interesting this morning regarding what do you know? What is being prepared about the Palestinians who will have to leave the Gaza Strip? You told me about floating hospitals that are already being prepared. Can you give us some more information? Because so far we don't have any solid information regarding what's going on with those people, because Egypt will not open its borders. No other Muslim countries seem willing to take them in, and those people are kind of lost in this very, very short strip of land. So what about the information that you have today? Before I share this information with you, in relation to this situation that has started since the 7th of October, let me tell you the following. It would be very simple if we were only talking about Gaza. At this moment, as we see all those land operations have split Gaza in two, the northern and the southern part of Gaza. So we don't know how Gaza is going to be geographically after the end of the war. And of course, we don't know anything about the governance or who will take the responsibility for Gaza. And let me give you a piece of news that I just learned from the Turkish media about an hour ago. It's very fresh. And nobody has confirmed it yet, but it has been commented by Israeli officials. Turkish media said that there was an attempt to assassinate, as it is said, to assassinate a convoy carrying the president of the Palestinian authorities. It was transmitted by EHA, the Turkish media. It has been uploaded online by the newspaper Türkiye about half an hour ago, and it has been commented only from Israel Hayom, which is a newspaper, a widely known newspaper here in Israel. And it has been commented by an anonymous Israeli official who said that it is a fact that in the last couple of days there was an increase in the security of Mahmoud Abbas because he's afraid for his life, because Hamas doesn't want to see the Palestinian authorities being responsible for the Gaza Strip, as it is today or as it will be the day after tomorrow. So there was an assassination attempt, according to the news yet you shared with us. Let me tell you. And nobody's able to confirm whether this is true, but this confirms the facts that after listening to all these comments about the next day, please, Mr. Charitos, just a minute.
You're just checking right now. Γιατί έχουμε και έναν φίλο μας καθηγητή από την Τουρκία που θα την ελέγξει και την πληροφορία.
We have a friend from Turkey who will check it for us. So it's Turkiye newspaper and the tweet from HAA. It has a video also. So what I wanted to tell you was that on one hand, we know who's going to win this Gaza fight, but we don't know the geographical expansion of Gaza that we're going to talk in the day after the war, and also the governance of Gaza. And if this piece of news is true, is confirmed, we don't know how many other different events we're going to have to wait for until we realize that the fight for Gaza is over. It's been a month, let me remind you, and the front that was activated in May 21 with the mixed cities in Israel, such as Ramle, Lot, Akko, Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem, in those mixed cities, the situation is still under control. And from what I gather, the Arab minority in Israel is 20% of the population. By seeing this ferocity of what happened on October 7th, they feel, and I have also talked with friends, Arab friends, who are not necessarily Palestinians. They do feel as Palestinians, and they couldn't believe their eyes. They couldn't believe what they saw. So let me add another thing. It's very early to talk about estimates because there are information that we don't have. There are many leaks from state officials and pieces of news that have been publicized Friday, about a week ago, from Idiot Chronot, with testimonials from officials of the Israeli army who have talked with Hamas fighters, that some of the people that took part in this slaughter, in this massacre of October 8th, they were also people who were not from Gaza. And this has been publicized because of the reason they speak the Arabian language. Mostly people from Libya, from northern Egypt. They have this type of pronunciation. This was mentioned 3 weeks ago. It was leaked from the state channel. So it has been mentioned from a very important reportage by Yota Chronot. And also, I would like to share with you an issue to discuss, a food for thought, let's say. For about a year and a half, the Hamas organization has projected its own character. Last summer, not this summer, in 2022, there was a very interesting phenomenon. During this summer, there was a round of violence between Israel and the Islamic Jihad. Jihad had started launching rockets towards the cities. We all are aware of that. The Israeli army, the Israeli Air Force, went to the offensive. The Islamic Jihad wanted Hamas to take part in this conflict and to show some help, let's say. Hamas did not. And let me remind you, why did Hamas did not help? In July 2022, Biden was here, and he made some contacts with the Israeli from one side, and then Mahmoud Abbas on the other, and asked them to first fix their own democracy and then talk about independence. And within this framework, it was announced by the Israeli government a few measures to build trust. It was apparent in the declarations of Biden, the State Department, and from leaks that Hamas was starting, slowly but surely, to rise in the appreciation of a player that could calm things down and be able to take power when the time was correct. Now, I'm not sharing information for no reason. Let me just tell you that the reason why it is obvious that the Israeli system, not Bibi, the army, the services, the institutions that the Israelis thought would be invincible so far, so that Hamas was starting to prepare itself and the Israeli world and the Palestinian popular opinion that it would be ready to become the next Abbas, let's say. And we see this information not from Gaza, from elsewhere. And we have a lot of things to learn in order to see what is the identity of this attack that happened in October 7th. So thank you so much, Gabriel. We will be back. Thank you so much for your first commentary, let's say. And let's move to Mrs. Catherine Faber. Welcome. Christine, I'm sorry, Faber. I don't know if you would like to make a comment based on what you just heard.
More specialized questions that I have for you.
We'll see how it goes. I think, first of all, thanks for having me here and for the invitation. How's that?
Yep.
Better? Okay. So first of all, thanks very much for having me here, and thank you for the invitation, and to the other panelists. I guess in response to some of the things I've heard, of course I don't know about this news of what's been said in Turkey, and maybe Soli is checking on that. But to go back to some of the comments that Professor Barkey made about how he sees things playing out kind of over the long term, I think there are two things that I would fundamentally agree with, and then one thing that I think I would disagree with. And so, his comments, suggested that Hamas will be destroyed. I think that's the point I fundamentally disagree with. That there will be a big reconstruction. and that Bibi's days are numbered. I would agree with those second 2 points, but I think I would disagree with this first point that Hamas would be destroyed. And the reason I disagree is precisely because of the warning and the type of warning that the Biden administration has given to Netanyahu to not make the mistakes that my country made in invading Iraq, starting a war in Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. I think what that experience shows us, I mean, in the wake of the Iraq war, Iraq is plausibly a bit more democratic, but surely controlled, quite frankly, by Iran. Popular mobilization forces run free, and you also saw the rise of ISIS, which was a terrorist organization that descended from the roots of Al-Qaeda. And even that conflict has not ended. The Islamic State was destroyed, but you have millions of people displaced in Iraq internally, in displacement camps, who are accused of collaborating with the Islamic State, or did collaborate with the Islamic State, whose future is unknown, and these are basically the terrorist grounds and breeding grounds of the future. And so with so much kindling and flammable material in the region, just take a look around the region. Lebanon descended into chaos after the explosions in 2019. Hezbollah has a strong foothold there. There's not a functional government. Syria is in very bad shape. We forget the mass exodus and type of warfare that happened in Syria, which basically cleansed Syria of populations in Aleppo, which now find themselves in Turkey. And all of these conflicts suggest that extremists, if they want, they move around.
Mm-hmm. We're getting echo where we're sitting from
so
here.
They move around, and so,
Yeah.
you know, although Hamas may be neutered, the leadership may be toppled, Gaza may be destroyed. Given the organization's connections with adjacent states, adjacent governments, Soli spoke very nicely, I think, about connections with Qatar. I don't see Hamas disappearing anytime soon. And so I think, you know, wars that attempt to eradicate extremist organizations through also the cleansing of civilian populations are quite risky business.
You've written and spoken quite extensively about religion and state. Now, how much political and how much religious is this war?
You know, I think that's an interesting question because by the time I had finished some of that writing on religion and the state, and I was, you know, especially in the case of Turkey, actually, there had been a turn in the thinking about Turkish politics that, okay, so Erdogan and the AKP, they're Islamists, but really we should think about them as autocrats more than Islamists, and think about populism and turn away from religion and religious thinking when it comes to the structure of conflicts. But I think what you see right now, galvanized across the region, and especially amongst Arab publics, is a strong resurgence of not necessarily a religious extremism, but a deep concern for disrespect of Muslim populations globally and their predicament in the global South. And this has to do with the hypocrisy and the actions of the United States, with the special relationship that Israel has with many countries in the region, and also I think the genuine disappointment that that both leadership and actual populations in Arab states are feeling when they thought that they were getting so close to some sort of regional settlement with the Abraham Accords. And obviously the missing piece there was Saudi. Religion is very central, no matter what MBS has tried to do to downplay the role of religion in that state. It certainly is not absent. And so these are publics that are pious. I wouldn't go so far to say is that we're entering the territory of a clash of civilizations. I think that would be hyperbole. But I do think that we need to think seriously about the role of religion in these conflicts and how it galvanizes publics.
Okay. Now, another question which keeps on going around in my head, and not always in a way that I could avoid characterizing it as even provocative a little bit. Why did we have to go through this brutal act October the 7th, to being urged by many political commentators to remember the fight and the fate of the Palestinian people. Really, who has helped them? And when was the last time that the Palestinians, these people that we are seeing every day being covered in ashes and being killed and whatever, when was the last time do we remember them being in the news?
Well, I think, there was, in the discussion around the Abraham Accords, and as that kind of unfolded, the emphasis was on some of the positives and on the low-hanging fruit and getting those negotiations going. So things like tech transfer, reestablishing diplomatic relations, opening the region for business and business development. But the Palestinian issue was always there, looming large in the background. But as was discussed on the previous panel, I think the thing to often also note is, although regimes in Arab states, Arab governments, and Arab publics oftentimes wax lyrical about their support for Palestinians and the Palestinian issue, at the end of the day, many of these people do not want to let internal functioning of the security apparatus in that state. But I think he has concerns that that security apparatus, his own security apparatus, is infiltrated by extremist elements, and he's gone a long way to try to obviously exterminate the Muslim Brotherhood, many of them resettled in Turkey. Why other Arab states don't necessarily want to champion the Palestinian cause is the Palestinian cause is not necessarily always one cause. Once Hamas took over in Gaza, and there was the division in Palestinian Authority and Hamas, Arab states chose who they wanted to deal with to the detriment of civilian populations. And we're now also looking at an international system of civilian protection that has been really severely eroded. And personally, this is what really worries me, and this extends beyond things that are happening in the region and relates to things that are happening within Europe, things that are happening in places as far-flung as Pakistan. So recently, you may have seen that the Pakistanis have decided to deport nearly 1 million Afghanis. This is a mass deportation. So Soli used the word population transfer. I think Professor Choukalis also used the word population transfer. That's a euphemism. We are entering into a time in which humanitarian norms have kind of gone out the window, and people are openly advocating for mass deportations. And we're seeing all sorts of securitized movements in Europe as well, striking deals and pacts with Arab countries, whether it be Tunisia, Egypt, or elsewhere, to prevent migration flows from destabilizing European publics, especially on the eve of European elections. So I'm also, I think, states, maybe with the exception of Turkey, who likes to play mediator and is willing to take populations in because it strengthens its hand as a negotiator in some ways. But states are oftentimes loath to take these populations in. They're traumatized, and they're worried about extremist elements.
Okay. Thanks very much. We'll have another round of discussion, and then maybe we can open up to questions. So last but certainly not least, Ino Afendouli,
you heard before. I don't know whether you want some comments before the questions, or you have anything to comment about what we heard before. No, I wouldn't comment, my dear Christos. Let us move on with the discussion. Yes, but many people in the previous panel said that maybe they can foresee a window of opportunity here through that destruction that we're living right now. Even remotely or not. Well, this will depend on the reply of the international community, and that is why I would like to focus my intervention not on what's happening in the region now, which is quite serious, but on how the EU, NATO, and the USA react to the crisis, and to what extent is it possible to face this crisis from the institutional organization that today exists rather in the West. The speakers before moved on with an exhaustive description and analysis of the different parameters of the current crisis. In my view, it is a follow-up of the deep friction that opened on September 11th. Since in Europe and in the USA, we have a tendency to put the religion factor aside, quite rightly, because our culture has different elements and is quite secular. I believe that we have undermined how deep was the friction, how deep was the rupture of 9/11. We put that aside because terrorism was dealt with geographically quite far away from Europe or the USA, in Afghanistan at first. Both wars were a disaster for the interests of the West. They solved no problem at all. Quite on the contrary, they made problems more acute. And these days we have a deep rupture that I cannot tell how can be healed. This is one element that should be taken into account, because I believe that we must not be under the deceptive idea that what's happening now in Gaza will end simply or easily, because the solutions that are on the table are unfortunately semi-complete. It is being said, for instance, that there will be a trust in Gaza, a committee in Gaza. I don't know whether this idea is effective, nor can I predict whether this type of efforts may solve the problem. When we have seen on the surface what we are saying, the divine in politics, that is, when there is this stance in politics, unfortunately results are preposterous. If we do not realize that there is this aspect as well for the Islamic world, that in my view only that dimension exists, so we have a difference in languages and in communication between the West and the Islamic world, moderate or not, because now there is a risk of not having moderate Islam even longer through this crisis. And apologies, I don't leave you to breathe, says the speaker to the moderator. I'm happy to have with us the minister and the president Venizelos. Well, what's happening is that there is a rupture of a consensus in international relationships, which used to legitimize the big players on the international scene. What do I mean? This consensus, in my view, is broken due to the war in Ukraine. Russia used to be a very effective factor of stability for the Middle East. Since Russia doesn't play in the Middle East, or it plays against the West, then there is a big problem there. So we need a new consensus, and this crisis, this will be the opportunity, in my view, due to this crisis. I wish that we can be led to this new consensus, but in what way? With the US, with China, with the EU? And let me come to the end. Well, we heard that the EU seems to be very decreased, and it seems to be quite weakened. And if this is said by Lucas Tsoukalis, then I agree with him. What can I see about the EU? In my view, the following happens. The EU, throughout the decades of its existence, had one reply to international problems, or the problems of the European territory. That reply was enlargement. We enlarged the EU to extend stability, peace, well-being to the geographic boundaries of the EU. Now, we cannot talk about enlargement in the Middle East. There's no perspective of enlargement with these countries. Is there a perspective of enlargement with Ukraine? Possibly, yes. What we need, and I'm pretty happy because we have specialists with us, Takis is one of them, what in my view will be needed by the EU, if it wants to be a player, which is not today, is a third way, a third way a third route, something that will not be membership, but it will be a substantial partnership. Otherwise, we will lose this territory because other forces will cover the gap. How do you interpret the stance of Turkey as said before in the previous panel right now? Because Turkey has chosen side. President Erdogan has expressed himself vis-à-vis the war between Israel and Hamas. For the time being, this does not affect negatively our own relationships or whatever is channeled theoretically or even practically. Maybe the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will tell us some news if there is anything on the agenda. But we are in uncharted waters right now. What do you think? You mean in the Greece-Turkey relationships? No, I wouldn't say so. There is a specific framework that both governments have adopted. We need this framework to deliver. This is to the benefit of both countries. I believe that both sides in the Aegean can move towards this direction. However, what we must not forget is that Turkey has a specific orientation when we're talking about the Middle East and influence in the Muslim world. Yes, but Erdogan is a person who is quite extrovert. He's wearing the scarf and he's shouting, I am pro-Hamas. Mitsotakis has taken a specific stance. He went to Tel Aviv, he met Netanyahu, and he says, we are pro-Israelis. Yes, but this doesn't alleviate the possibility for a bilateral dialogue. Nixon used to talk to Mao Zedong. Kissinger used to talk to the Russians. We must talk one to each other. We must talk to Erdogan, and we must accept him as he is, and do not imagine him the way we would have wanted him to be. This is very important to achieve specific things, because Erdogan is who he is. That is his identity. If we realize that, I believe that we can have a more sincere dialogue. Erdogan will not give away his possibility to intervene in the Middle East because this is something he is deeply concerned with, that is the religious feeling. I see. I don't know whether there is anybody from the audience who would like to intervene or raise a question. Please, to anybody out of the 5 panelists. We have still online from the USA Professor Barkey and Mr. Haritos from Israel. Or maybe somebody would like to make a remark or a comment. Please.
Is Professor Barkey still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Did you manage to hear some of our discussion, Professor Barkey?
Yes, I did. I heard it all.
Would you like to comment on anything and say something more, maybe? I feel that we've heard so many things over the past 2 or 3 weeks, watching television, reading newspapers, sites, that I'm sorry,
I can't hear you.
I'm not very sure if we have the actual proper picture of what is actually happening right now in the Middle East. Are you comfortable with what you know?
Look, as somebody once said, to make predictions is always very dangerous when it's about the future. So let me just say that we will see a lot of turbulence. There's no question that we will see, as I said earlier, there'll be spoilers, there'll be groups, countries that will try to take advantage of this. Everybody has their own agenda. But there is a certain logic globally about finally resolving this. And in that sense, I think the changes let's face it, in the Palestinian population as well. Hamas started this, and the Palestinian civilian population is paying the price for it. So, they also have to start asking themselves the question of accountability. And in some ways, it is possible that we will see maybe positive changes within excuse me, Palestinian community as well. I mean, this is too traumatic an event for it not to have long-term consequences. It doesn't have to be necessarily positive, but I think the inclination, and I think uh, we as a global community should push for a positive outcome. And I think it's possible. It's been done before. So why can't it be done again? And that's what I would say. And in terms of thinking about the future, we have to take a constructive approach. Otherwise, what's the point?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. We still have 2 minutes left. Katrine, can you, any comment before we say goodbye? Yeah,
Μήπως
Katrine.
Sure.
Yeah,
I think
first.
Professor Barkey is maybe a little bit more optimistic than I am about the capacity of this particular moment in time to generate some sort of new consensus or some sort of new form of cooperation. And I think for me, fundamentally, one of the reasons why goes back to the question that you asked him from the outset, which was, you feel like you don't really have a very good picture of what is going on. And I think this is a region with a real democratic deficit. And I don't want to be the American who is here on the panel talking about democracy promotion, because that would be hypocritical, saying what I had just said about the invasions in Iraq and elsewhere. But I think the one thing that democracy does give you, it does provide you with a lot of information about what publics are thinking, about what governments are thinking, about the way things are headed. And in the region, that type of information is in increasingly short supply. And so we don't have a very good and visible picture. We're also living in an era of fake news. We're living in an era in which researchers are shut out of research sites, and foreigners and others who engage in regional studies are villainized. And so, this is the climate of today, and it's an era of power politics. And so I have a little bit less optimism that we might come to some sort of great solution when it's a matter of negotiation primarily between increasingly autocratic powers and a destabilized United States with a Trump presidency potentially on the horizon. And as Professor Tsoukalis very nicely laid out, a Europe that is weak and lacks effective military and defense capabilities.
Now, in this situation, the question is for both of you. We've almost forgotten about the other war that is in our neighborhood as well. It's about more than 620 days ongoing all the time. People are, many lives are getting lost, and there is still this war going on. How is there any way that that will be affected by what is happening in the Middle East, or vice versa?
I think that the other war, no matter how paradox it is more restrained, because it is a war between a superpower and a smaller country, but it is a conventional war. It is a war on soil, on territory, and the prestige of Russia. Russia has failed in this war. Yeah, but there are some interests in the Middle East. I'm talking about Russia. Putin has a presence and a gaze turned towards the Middle East. Due to the war in Ukraine, Russia is not possible to exercise pressure. Otherwise, there could be pressure in the Middle East by Russia. That is why influence is exerted behind the scenes. Apologies, Mr. Michailidis. May I? A second round for me as well? Or you have another plan in mind? A closing comment by you. Yes, please, Gabriel. Thank you so much. Thank you for this possibility. A comment when it comes to the role of Turkey. The role of Turkey should be seen pertaining to what happened in September in the framework of the UN Assembly after the meeting with Netanyahu, and the statements seen from the Turkish side were that the ministries of energy will meet in November, that the two countries will continue with a possibility of joint extractions, common minings. This changed completely. There was a shift of 180 degrees by the Turkish president after what took place with the hospital in Gaza after what happened on October 7th. Turkey says again that it supports Hamas and that Hamas is not a terror organization but a liberating movement. I believe that the reason why it has adopted this stance is because it wants to prepare itself to become a middleman after the war. And right now, the whole West is against Hamas. Comes one country, a Muslim country, member of NATO, to be able to become the intermediate person, the intermediate country, in favor of the weak link of a negotiation, let's say a Madrid, as we saw before, because the only good thing of that can be a new Madrid situation. And this may guide to a new Oslo. Allow me to come to the end, please. Allow me to come to the end. Since we have limited time, yes, yes. Our time has come to end, says the moderator. May I, please? Yes, of course. Mr. Michailidis, thank you. So, following that, Turkey wants to play its own role. Why? Because they're not happy with the new geographic sharing of energy in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey hopes that in the aftermath of the war, the energy map will be renegotiated and Turkey will be able to achieve what they would have wanted, that is, a presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, a legalization, a legitimization of the entity that they have created in Cyprus, in northern Cyprus, that is, and reaching their final arguments. Like the northern part of Cyprus is excluded from the international community, likewise, the Gaza Palestinians are excluded by the Israelis. Upon the end of the war, wanting to be the advocate of the weak link, they would want to redesign the map. Thank you. Thank you back. Thank you back, Mr. Haritos. And would like to thank all the members of the panel for their participation. Thank you so much for this a bit difficult discussion, I would argue. Thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you indeed.
Αν μπορούμε να καθίσουμε.
So please take your seats so we can continue. It is already a bit late, but we have two more important panels before we close this conference. I insist on calling it a conference. I think that what we have heard, especially in this panel regarding overseas policies against regional and national insecurities, plus the role of asymmetry is a part of all those things that were discussed, and everything that's going on in foreign affairs. We also had the great pleasure of hearing Mrs. Alexandra Papadopoulou. It is the first time that I heard her speaking in public, and I think that they are a quite dynamic duo in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And now I would like to welcome the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Giorgos Gerapetritis, to make some final comments on everything that was discussed, especially based on Greece foreign affairs. Mr. Gerapetritis, please. Thank you, and welcome. Dear friends, the only certainty that we have is this 3-day conference of Vangelis Venizelos. Everything else has fallen apart. So, asymmetries, as it is the title of this conference, is our everyday, is in our everyday life. Asymmetry is a part of our daily lives. I had declared that I couldn't be here because the Prime Minister and I would be in China in an official trip that was shrunk, so I came here. On the other side, I will have to leave early because urgently we're going to France tomorrow when there's going to be a humanitarian meeting for Thursday, so I'm really sorry. I will have to leave right after my speech. In my opinion, there are 5 crises that define our times. Those 5 crises are, first of all, the aggressiveness, climate change, immigration, food crisis, and the crisis of public health. These 5 crises have 3 basic characteristics. Number 1, they make everything uncertain. There's no certainty on which we can build something, on which we can build foundations in order to do something predictable and base our policies on. In the past, we were thinking based on data regarding foreign affairs and policies in general. I think that right now we are working on scenarios, on hypothetical scenarios. A successful politician is not the one who anticipates the future, anticipates what's going to happen, is the one that has the answer for all the possible scenarios, because no one can predict what's going to happen. The second common thing among these great crises of our times is that there is no crisis that can be limited geographically. They do not have borders. They do not have a limited result. All those crises have a result that is completely without borders. It affects all countries. And the third thing is the fluidity. Uncertainty is different than fluidity. Fluidity is a result of contradictions. In January 21, for example, this is the example I'm looking for. In January 6th, in 2021, we had the attack on Capitol Hill. This attack reversed a constitutional segment which was taken for granted for the West. And for that reason, it was a terrifying experience for everyone, and especially for those that serve those institutions. One day before that, on January 5th, we had the election for the American Senate. In the state of Georgia, in the American South, which is a historic place of WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, for the first time in history, they elected a black senator, Raphael Warnock, and for the first time a Jew senator, John Ossoff, both Democrats that were elected on January 5th, one day before the attack in Capitol Hill. So we see how many things have changed due to those contradictions. And of course, all those things cultivate underlying inequalities. So all this inherent uncertainty and fluidity can be applied on foreign affairs as well. The effort that we are making, at least the effort I am making in order to be able to serve my country as best as I can, is to have principles, to have some principles that define our politics. And the principles I have adopted by order of the Prime Minister is active diplomacy. What I mean by that is the effort that is done for us to be ahead of the facts, to lead the facts and not just follow them. The last 4 years was an example of that, of this active foreign affairs policy. Let me remind you, Greek initiatives that were adopted at a European level or maybe a worldwide level. The RSF, the European COVID certificate, which allowed traveling in the middle of a pandemic. The fixed price on natural gas, which was adopted in the middle of the greatest energy crisis known to man. The mechanism to recover overgains from energy production companies. This was a Greek suggestion. The migration policy that is being concluded today with the European Agreement on Migration, they were Greek suggestions that were supported by the European Union, our family, our European family. Even today, those last conclusions by the European Council in October 26th, 27th, was the reflection, almost verbatim reflection, of all the values, all the principles that we have suggested after the beginning of the terrorist attack in October 7th. The second value of external politics that we do is the multifaceted diplomacy. Model diplomacy, sorry. This does not just mean face-to-face diplomacy or people-to-people diplomacy. It's a type of diplomacy that adopts the new versions of foreign affairs, especially what we publicly call public diplomacy, the image of the country, the branding of the country, how attractive it can be, and also the calm forms of power. You know, Greece is among the few countries of the world that has the most powerful and soft skills, soft power skills as well. What do I mean by that, by the soft power? Is this type of power that does not impose, but has the power to infiltrate. Maybe the expatriates, for example, the power of a language. And we tend to build on that day by day. And the third value that we support is a diplomacy of principles. Our external policies are not coincidental. We will not be affected by a fact that might appear out of the blue. Our policy is not transactional. We will not exchange goods in order for a country to win. We have principles, we have virtues, and of course it's not based on our selfish benefits. It's not a transaction. Our opinion is that honest, consistent diplomacy is the one that gives our country a strong position in the international stage. And I am saying that because I know, after being present in all the international fora as a Greece representative, is the international capital that we have acquired right now is even disproportionate to the historic power that we have over the modern world. So we need faith, we need consistency and belief in the international law, in the principles of negotiation. And it is impressive, actually. Greece is a candidate country for a non-permanent member of the Council of Security for 2025. Security Council, I'm sorry, for 2025. So it is interesting. The logo that we have adopted for that, in order to support its candidacy, are the 3 Ds in the Greek language, which encapsulate this logic of external policies: democracy, dialogue, and diplomacy. 3 words that are Greek, have Greek roots, of course, which have been exported in all the languages of the world, but they mostly promote what we are. We believe in democracy, we believe in dialogue, we believe in diplomacy. Now, those principles that I just recited for you, meaning the energetic policies, the active policy, is the one we try to apply in all crises. In the case of the Ukraine, in the case of the Middle East, we apply it in every crisis that has arose in the European family. So, Middle East is a crisis that can be characterized as a dynamic crisis that might end up being uncontrollable. If we go back in history to see the stand of Greece in the Middle East, the day after October 7th, I was traveling to Oman, in which I took part in a council of collaboration between the European Union and the countries of the Gulf. Our basic opinion for the Middle Eastern issue is as it was, is the same as it was. We said that we need to differentiate the Palestinian people from Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. We need to recognize the right to self-defense of Israel, but within the limits of international law, based on the principle of proportionality. We insist on the basic solution adopted by the Security Council of the UN, meaning 2 states, as it was set in 1967, with the capital of the Palestinian state in eastern Jerusalem. And then, after October 7th, a plan of 5 points, which included the points, as I said before, which were adopted by the European Union and are a part of all the declarations today. First, condemnation in any form of terrorism, inhumane handling and violence. Protection of civilians. Security, which must be provided in order for humanitarian help to be sent safely through humanitarian roads. Fourth, immediate release of hostages. And 5, international talks which will solve this very sad situation that exists in the Middle East. We have been benefited from that because now we can be honest, we can be consistent, and we can be respected from both sides. both from Israel, with which we have a strategic relationship which will be maintained, and with the Arab world, because this stance on principle is always applauded. Nobody can stand against you when you stand on your principles. And today, we are here to talk about today's situation in Gaza. As you know, Greece was one of the first countries that sent humanitarian aid in Gaza, a cargo of medicinal material that arrived yesterday in Sinai through the borders of Rafah. Greece is a pioneer when it comes to humanitarian aid, and we are a part of every discussion that is taking place on a sea route for humanitarian aid. We were in Cairo as well, with the Arab world, one of the few European countries to be there. We traveled to Israel in order to showcase our support to Israel, but also the limits which must be set by Israel. And of course, we will travel on Thursday, to Paris for the humanitarian meeting, and on Monday for the European Council on the Middle East. And about all those images that we all saw during the last month from Israel and Gaza, of course we condemn everything that we saw happening in this terrorist attack of October 7th, but on the other side we need to accept that this is what is happening is over the top. Of course they have the right to self-defense, but this is too much. Also, one last word. I see the president who wants to come to the podium. We have Mr. Tunis as a buffer here, but welcome, Ambassador. The buffer arrived. Honestly, when I have Mr. Tunis and Mr. Venizelos coming to the podium after me, I feel like the cover band of Deep Purple or Guns N' Roses or something. Oh, you missed the best. Now all you will listen is about Turkey. I know that you're all anxious to hear about Turkey. I paid attention to the previous panel of my friend Mr. Venidis. Now, regarding Turkey, there's no need to share someone's beliefs in order to be able to discuss with them. When we live in an apartment building, for example, it doesn't mean that we all need to believe the same things when we talk about catering of the building or the cleanliness or the security of the building. So we don't need to have the same views, but we need to discuss. I have 6 basic principles on that regarding the approach on Turkey by order of the Prime Minister. First of all, we ought to discuss with our neighbors. As the Prime Minister says, geography put us next to Turkey. This is something that we cannot change, but on the other hand, we ought to manage it. We must be honest. Second thing, international law will be our guide. Again, when I'm talking about the principles of foreign affairs, we cannot pick and choose, we cannot cherry pick from international law anytime there's an international difference, because at some point you will have to face the consequences. If we are consistent when it comes to international law, we will be justified. The third thing is all the things that have to do with national sovereignty do not belong to the agenda. Fourth, we should have some safety valves So when we talk about a disagreement, this should not lead to a crisis. I feel that we have achieved that at an acceptable degree. Maybe sometimes we should talk more, the two ministers of foreign affairs, and solve matters that are of low consequence, maybe. But maybe this is the way to solve the problems that might arise. Fifth, a long period of calmness, which we have been experiencing for the past 10 months over the Aegean Sea, is by itself a win. It is very important to talk about quiet, calmness in our neighborhood. And we can enjoy that. And last thing, peace and prosperity. In my opinion, peace and prosperity do not come from inaction. Peace and prosperity come from a straight judgment and bravery in decision making. And at some point, the people who have the public power should understand that they are not owners of this power. They're just wielders. And the most important thing is to include the future generations in your policies. So my intention, by order of the Prime Minister, is to be brave and touch subjects that have been open for decades. We are positive, we are consistent, we are taking steps to move forward in the future. But we believe that we will be able to solve those issues for the generations to come, to have a homeland that is safer and a neighborhood that will give them prosperity. So with these words, I would like to thank you warmly before I concede the podium to the ambassador and to our dear professor, and wish you all a good evening.
This seventh meeting, organized by SECO with the same title, is reaching the end. It will end up with the way you know, but before that, we shall have the opportunity to listen to the ambassador of the US, Mr. Tunis. We shall do that quite in an interesting way because he has the hat of being the US ambassador to Greece, but while he's serving here in the Athens embassy, his presence at the level of society is so intense that he has become a person to recognize for the public sphere of our country, which is an achievement. Your Excellency, Ambassador, please, you have the floor. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor to be with you and a great joy. I would like to deeply thank you for that. I lost 34 kilos this year, and it's just the photo. Thank you so much for choosing this photo for me losing weight. I told my Mom, you know, it's been quite a while since we've last seen each other. I lost 34 kilos, I told her. Are you going to put them on? A Greek mom, a typical Greek mom, asking about my weight.
For this kind invitation. I am here principally as an FOVV, Friend of Vangelis Venizelos. And I am a huge admirer of my friend. There is nothing more enjoyable than having a tsiporo and a long discussion on international and constitutional law with the professor. I've realized who the professor is, and I'm merely a student. I get a similar experience, you know, when it was State Minister Yerepetridis, but now he just wants to talk about foreign policy, no longer constitutional law. Mr. Minister, thank you for everything that you do to not only contribute to what is a vibrant and deep and meaningful U.S.-Greece relationship, but I wanted to thank you and thank the Prime Minister and the government of Greece for your most constructive efforts in the time of Megalis Diskoulias. You know, we live in very trying times here, and it is going to take the full measure of the work of outstanding diplomats like the foreign minister to solve some of the crises that we are experiencing. I will say on this matter that every life is important, whether it be Palestinian, Israeli, or any other life, that we should work to make sure that the very best of our humanity is emphasized. When my government, 247 years ago, when my country wanted to stand up a government, we wanted one that was full of freedom and opportunity. And we based this on the ethos, the principles, the values that were born right here in Athens. Where in Athens, for the first time, a group of people came together in a sense of self-determination, that we will develop the government that represents us. This has been best practices in government and in life for thousands of years ago, and we owe it all to the ancient Greeks. But democracies don't only give you more freedoms, more safety, they give you richer, more opportunistic lives. Folks, when people tell me that democracy is an outmoded form of government, I'm like, oh, really? A lot of people trying to move to Venezuela these days? A lot of people trying to move to Iran? I assure you, Russia does not have an immigration problem. But people are trying to move to democracies with determination. I mean, think of what it takes for a woman to put her 2-year-old on her back and take her 4-year-old by her hand and enter into an inflatable to come to a land that possesses hope. There's 117 million displaced persons in this world. 50% are children. They're not coming to take jobs or destroy our way of life. They're fleeing community violence and war and oppression. You know, when my parents, and I think the story of my family is well known in Greece.
My mom and dad came from the same village. They knew about poverty. They knew what poverty meant. 3 rooms in our whole house. No electricity, no water. When I visited the first time, I learned their life back then. My dad was an orphan. He went to a school there, he finished high school, and his name was Dimitris Tunis Orphan, and his mom faced many problems. My dad has to be there to assist her through the end of her days. They came to the US without knowing the language, without any money. They migrated.
And they had an opportunity to rebuild their lives. And there were opportunities for all of us. Both my sisters and I went on to get advanced degrees. And it gave us opportunities where I'm now able to have built a business and able to serve my country. Democracies are wonderful. But we are of an ethos, of a philotimo, where we understand that these freedoms and values and these opportunities need to exist for everybody, not just the privileged, but every single person in society. We have an ethos where we need to make sure that we are providing opportunities for everyone. I wanted to talk about gender equality. Folks, we cannot solve the great issues of the day, whether it's food scarcity, whether it's climate challenges, and they exist. It seems the 100-year storm is happening every 18 months. And it's not just in Greece. You saw what happened in Maui, one of the wealthiest places in the world, and how the island was consumed by fire. In France, in Canada, they're global challenges that we have to work together to solve. But if we think we're going to solve these great problems of the day by sidelining 50% of the intellectual capital of the world, we are mistaken. When the history of this century is written, it is not going to be about Ukraine. It is not going to be about COVID. It is going to be about the emergence of women in businesses and society, taking leadership roles. Countries, cities, communities, companies that get this right will prosper, and those that don't or won't will not. Now, I don't come from the diplomatic corps, I come from the business community. And I can show you a McKinsey study, a Goldman Sachs study that says when you have a diversity of inputs, a diversity of backgrounds sitting at the table, you outperform the S&P 500. You are more vibrant. You are more empathetic. Women are crucial. They're crucial in moving society forward. Folks, does anyone think that a bunch of octogenarian males from Italy is the optimal decision-making body? The world is globalized, it's fast-moving, and we need to accept the fact that we need everyone at the table with a sense of equity and inclusion to move our society forward, that we can do better and provide opportunity for everyone. Income disparity is a global phenomenon. I think it's the biggest challenge in my own country. Now, we are a meritocracy and we cannot determine where people will finish, but we have an obligation to make sure that we're equalizing the opportunities, to give everyone a great opportunity. I mean, I loved what was the mission of Colegio. There are so many people that serve in the highest forms of government that came from Kathy Wonieti Saladas. Yati Idaskali Van.
Because teacher said, oh, this is a very clever boy, let's send him to specific school, and then this person may help us. This is the homeland we need.
A fundamental fairness and inclusion. We have to have an understanding that love is love, that people deserve to be who they are and be accepted by everyone. You know, Jesus Christ said, I'm not here to judge, I'm here to help. The Pope said, I am not here to judge. It is not up to us to determine what is love, but it is up to us to make sure that we have a society that people can be who they are and not live in fear. That we live in a world and create. We are thought leaders here. I applaud all of you for coming because you are the leaders of Greece. That we create a country and we have a voice globally that is one of enlightenment and one of inclusion. That we drown out those that emphasize division and hatred. And that is a very, very loud voice. We have an autocrat in Europe who felt that he can change a nation's boundaries by force, upsetting the rules-based international order that existed in Europe for decades. And folks, I am a little concerned because we're not talking about Ukraine enough. And this issue is far better, far more important than merely Ukraine. And it's important because every autocrat in the world is looking to see what is the determination of the Western world. What is our determination to make sure that Mr. Putin does not succeed? Because if he does succeed, who knows what other autocrat in the world will think, well, this is now allowed in 2022 and 2023. Let me see what other country I can change by force. We have to make sure that we are determined. I am reminded, as we just celebrated Ohi Day, that most of the world celebrates VE Day in Europe. The victory over fascism in Europe, but not Greece. Greece celebrates its entry into the war because that is its philotimo, that is its ethos.
When there were difficulties,
on the verge of becoming fascist, when the world had lost hope, Greece held out and delivered the first victory of an allied power over an Axis power. It gave the world hope. Archbishop Dimaskinos, the Archbishop of Athens, the first regent of Greece, and someone, I'll have you know, who went to Lakio, so de como to chorio, sto platano, sto dopo.
visited my place, Platanos, my village. He was such a poor person, he barely wore some shoes back then.
Open letter to Hitler protesting the taking of Greek Jews because the Holy Church knew no difference between religions, between peoples. We are all brothers and sisters. We are all God's children, all of us. All of us. But think of the courage it took for the Archbishop to do that. This is our Philotimo. He was on the cover of Life magazine. I'm so proud to be an ambassador here because Greece is always on the right side of history. It's impactful. It's values-based. It's reliable. And my government understands full well what a sincere, reliable ally is. And they do the things when it's difficult. Not merely principled, but difficult. Greece was, I believe, the second country to sanction Russia, and it was difficult. They paid a price economically, but they did it anyhow. Not every country did that. This is why I'm so proud to be posted in Greece. And all the things that I talk about, a commitment to human rights, a commitment to equality, a commitment to gender equality, a commitment to LGBTQI issues, a commitment to all these things. I say this, not as a sense of history. My own country had slavery about 150 years ago. Women couldn't vote in the United States about 100 years ago. Women couldn't get a credit card in their own name 50 years ago in the United States. We had Dred Scott laws and they were lynching people. We are not perfect. My own constitution promises that things will be better. It's aspirational, a more perfect union. We are not there yet. And I don't speak about criticism. I appeal to the leaders of this beautiful country that we all have an obligation to make this the best possible world it can be. To make sure that every child, whether they have a disability, whether they don't have a disability, and 20% of the children have a disability, that they reach their full potential. That it doesn't matter where you were born or the color of your skin. That if we take someone who fled oppression and we put the children in school and we give them a job, that in 5 or 10 years they are Greek. You know, in this crisis, we went from you couldn't find a job to that this not only benefits society, but it's the right thing to do for the bottom line. So as I hope we all move together, nations and thought leaders together, for a more perfect union, a world that celebrates democracy but makes sure that the benefits are shared by everyone, that everyone is allowed to reach their full potential. Because who knows which one of those children we help can become a Yerepetridis or a Venizelos. Απ' τη βάθεια την καρδιά μου, σε ευχαριστώ.
From the depth of my heart, thank you so much. Thank you.
Κυρίες και κύριοι,
Ladies and gentlemen, I could say, ladies and gentlemen, Evangelos Venizelos. And close my mic. But I should say that this was designed in a different way, because we would expect Dora Bakoyanni to be with us, and there would be a discussion that would be the end of this part on foreign policy, but I imagine that many things could have been debated. Dora had a small accident, luckily a small one, that obliges her to avoid transfer for some days. Something bigger than I had with my finger. I think that we shall have the chance to have this debate, this discussion in the days to come with Dora. You shall be updated, and I will try to be there. I will try to be there to moderate that discussion. However, change of plans. We adapt, so we will come to the end of this whole cycle. Both of us. I will ask, you will reply, etc. Thank you so much for this privilege. And if I may, I would like to start in the following way. Let's take the thread from a previous cycle. Some years ago, it was a pivotal topic of this discussion, the question about what this effort of the West means to restructure as a geostrategic subject, that is, undertake a role again, change the international balance, and what would be the post of Greece in this restructuring of the West as a strategic subject. But nowadays, here we are. The West is given a fight through representatives in Ukraine and is involved, not willingly, in a war in the Middle East. Where do we stand? That is, how does this change the landscape? What about this conjuncture? First of all, thank you very much, all of you who were with us, and you are with us for this year's conference. I would like to thank from the depth of my heart the Minister of Foreign Affairs who is with us, Mr. George Tserapetridis, my dear colleague, the Ambassador of the US to the Hellenic Republic, who delivered a brilliant speech on the USA values, but also on the Greek values, talking through his experience, but in a very targeted way, because his speech has a political tone and a political objective. And I think that as a result, he is a brilliant representative of his administration in a familiar place for him in his birthplace. I would like to thank you all the speakers, all the moderators, and of course Pavlos Tsimas. And let me also express on behalf of all of us our love and our support to Mrs. Dora Bakoyannis, who had this small accident, and unfortunately she can't have this opportunity to join us tonight. But as Pablo said, we shall organize that meeting quite shortly in the weeks to come, a discussion on foreign policy with the participation of Mrs. Bakoyannis. Now let me come to your question. You always go to the heart of things. This morning, I delivered a small speech in the Parliamentary Assembly of the French-speaking community that convenes in Athens. The president would be Dora Bakoyannis, who couldn't be the chair of that. And the topic of my speech, incidentally, was the following. All the different interpreting schemes in international relationships and volatility, because these days it is doubtful whether we can communicate through a common code and whether the old discrimination among which the notion of the West might preserve its full content. The world, of course, is not a unipolar one, but the USA still are the only country that has all the different characteristics of a superpower. On the other hand, the world that still has some monopolar characteristics is not the old bipolar world, nor have we reached the multipolar world yet. So in reality, we don't have a specific scheme that can be operational or functional. The French are talking about a world that is multipolar, that is much discussion, much debate about multipolarism. But this means nothing, because we have no scheme, we have no legal background to support it. There's no legal scheme to organize global community after the collapse of the UN, which became a victim of the fact that a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia that is the perpetrator of the invasion, the perpetrator of the international crime of invading Ukraine, and as a result, it is non-functional, the Security Council, that is the main body to maintain peace and impose sanctions. So we must find, in front of this volatility and in view of this fragmentation of the international system and international law, some solutions that are solutions that can be internal. Paradoxically, in the Middle East, which is taking place since October 7th onwards, everybody acknowledges, even the ones that challenge the role of the USA, that the USA will have the initiative. That is, there's no objection by the other permanent members of the Security Council. There's no Chinese objection to that, or let's say a Russian objection about these initiatives that are undertaken on a political level, but also on a strategic level. You know that there is intense strategic presence in the area that guarantees and delimitates. It both guarantees and imposes limits and some behaviors. This is something that should be recorded because it can be the trigger for the processing of a new scheme of some type of consensus, at least when it comes to a minimum one. If we go from liquidity of the international system to something else, to a reorganization that should be realistic. But realism means that the West must acknowledge the fact that the system is not unipolar. So, having said that, it should leave some space to other players trying to prevail when it comes to the balance of narratives, because not all narratives are equal. The Western narrative is of paramount importance because the Western narrative is our acquis. It is about liberal democracy, the rule of law, human rights. We cannot say that all narratives have the same value. We accept that there are other narratives as well. We do respect, since we are realists, we are aware of the balance of powers. We are trying to shape a very functional scheme about the international world, the international community, on a real and on a legal basis, but we believe in the value of our acquis. And I think that this is quite meaningful, because this acquis is the acquis of a small percentage of the world's population. Very few are the countries, and quite few is the percentage of the world population that is covered by this asset. As a result, indeed, I've said what you said, and something added to that, that the strategic sublayer of the West, in my view, depends on two things. First, the internal cohesion of the USA. That is, the absolute priority is to get rid of the rupture that we said before, get rid of a potential civil war in the US, get rid of this deep clash that has an impact on the foreign policy of the USA, and it brings in a very tough position the West as a whole and the European Union mainly. This is the first factor. And in my view, the second factor is India. In the world balance of forces, regardless of different shapes, regardless of schemes, BRICS, the Worldwide South, or any other scheme or structure, I believe that where India lies, with its huge population, with its huge potential that is of paramount importance, is of critical importance. So we, of course, we pay attention to our bilateral relationship with the USA, to the Greek-American strategic partnership. Of course, the vast majority of member states in the EU have no hesitation, and they are also paying attention to their partnership with the USA and to the role of NATO. Europe does know pretty well that since the end of World War I until today, the problem of European security is a problem, is a Euro-Atlantic problem. Europe fully perceives that since President Putin raised the question of nuclear threat few days after the invasion to Ukraine, Europe has a shortage of 5,000 nuclear heads to have a balance of terror and to have an effective nuclear counterbalance. So alone, no nukes, so no security on the level of defense and security without the US. There might be security at the level of defense industry, but not at the level of defense. If you have an experience from NATO that I have lived as a Ministry of Defense and a Minister of Foreign Affairs for many years, you can understand what is the true relationship between the USA and European partners, including Canada. The relationship is, let's say, schematically, I'm not trying to be accurate, but let me give you an overview. It is a relationship 80 to 20. 80% the US importance, 20% the importance of all others, which is a reality. As a result, there is a risk of the West as a strategic entity from itself. That is why we must focus on the internal affairs in Europe, because European societies put in doubt the endurance of liberal democracy. Europe is afraid of its elections always, and they feel safe when results are good, but there is a risk coming from the US elections. And Europe would wish to support the USA in its transition needed to find again its pace. If the US elections create a problem of redefinition in terms of strategy. This is what I see in fear, and I do hope that we must discuss being honest, in depth, and be prepared for any potential scenario. That is why Greece should be prepared according to its size. It's a mid-sized to small European country, but it should be prepared for a phase that the reference point will not be that simple or that functional as we have used to, both the European and the American one. As a result, in my view, this is the biggest asymmetry, which is an asymmetry that I rank after the problem of climate crisis. And I think that this should be the sub-layer for our analysis on foreign affairs and the security and defense politics, but also when it comes to the other parameters of power in our country, because a parameter of safety is competitiveness and the operation of the different institutions, the rule of law, democracy, and of course what said by the ambassador, His Excellency, that it takes a faith and ethos, which is pivotal, what we are proud of, but it's very difficult to find a proper importance for that.
So let me note the use of the word ethos from Mr. Tsounis, the ambassador, was repeated constantly, and I think that this is very important, the choice of this term, the Greek term. Also the mention for India. I imagine that Mr. Zepos, our dear ambassador, who has been trying for years to draw our attention to the importance of India. Comment of the microphone, I'm sorry. Mr. Kalogeropoulos also, yes. I recently had the talk with Mr. Zepos for that. So we just discussed answers to a series of questions that were not even posed. I will start from the last. What does it mean for us, for Europe, for the world? A possible negative outcome of the American election. You answered that. What does this mean for Greek external politics, this asymmetry? We have Europe, which voted in 3 different ways in the UN, all the member states of the European Union, so there was no sense of common ground in politics. What does this mean for Greek foreign affairs? To live in a neighborhood that is so uncertain, unstable. This current crisis in the Middle East was discussed a lot today. And this is a proof that in reality, peace in Middle East cannot become a reality if we forget about the Palestinian issue. We cannot say that it is a matter of internal safety of Israel. If the US leaves this area to focus on the Pacific Ocean, it's not also a solution. There is a conflict between optimists and pessimists. Optimists say that every time there was an effort to find peace in Middle East, there was a war before that. The pessimists say that we are living in a different world, in which, as Ino Afedouli said, in which a dogmatic theological approach has the upper hand. And in this type of environment, we cannot proceed with a dialogue. Yes, I will follow your train of thought from the previous question. Internal politics and the stance of societies affects in a catalytic way the foreign policy. We cannot do foreign policy if we do not have internal policy, and if society doesn't want to proceed with foreign affairs, you're not allowed to do that. If the political system cannot do foreign affairs, you will not do that, or you will do that towards a direction that is inwards and not outwards. This is taught by the history of the US, first of all. All great schools of Greek foreign politics, of American foreign politics, the Smithsonian, the Jeffersonian, and all of that, are all schools that are connected with an internal political speech, internal political correlations in different phases in the American history. We are captives of the Zurich and the London syndromes, because Karamanlis did the best deal he could possibly do along with Averov in 1960, and he was blamed for treason. Nobody wants to solve any type of problems. Therefore, it is of the utmost importance to form internal correlations. And on this opinion, the research by Metron Analysis that was presented on Sunday is optimistic, because it shows a society that finally realizes what does foreign affair means against the beliefs of the political parties. Because the common sense want Turkey, which is a part of the West, it is a part of NATO, which is impressive. It needs the Greek-Turkish dialogue that will touch many things, and also wants the opinion of The Hague in order to solve the problem of the
So we can solve the delimitation of the continental shelf. Okay, just before that, President, there are the ones in Nepal that have less fear, less phobic, that is. They are more optimistic, and there is an aspiration to find a solution. Yeah, but this is a solution of the public opinion, is it? We don't have the same prerequisites in the political sphere, so we must create these conditions in the political system, internally, first of all, of the special public opinion. This public opinion, I mean the academia, the diplomatic community, the community of the other professional operators, like, for instance, the armed forces, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself, and, of course, later there must be a discussion amongst the political parties of another type. We do not have the prerequisites of national strategy without a proper consensus. You might tell me, does this exist in other countries, in the USA, in France? Do they have such a consensus? Or does it exist in Italy? Each one should look into its affairs. Here we have an agenda which is very specific. Right now we have been talking after 50 years upon the Turkish invasion to Cyprus, and after the unilateral Turkish allegations since 1973 during the last phase of the junta. Here we must understand what was understood in the Middle East. That is, you cannot leave time to become a solution of problems, and you cannot put problems in brackets, because they become awakened and they can swallow you. So the notion of time in the example of the Middle East shows that we must redefine the sense of time in the Cyprus problem, and we must redefine the notion of time in the Greek-Turkish relationships. That is why now we can find no other scheme in the Middle East. The solution of the two states is not functional right now, nor the solution of the one state is functional, not even the transfer of the Palestinian population from Gaza to Sinai or anywhere else is feasible. And as a result, right now, there's no scheme, there's no structure. There are some in-between thoughts, there are some testings, but not something complete. Nor is it easy to find something complete. And right now, there are no players. There's no prerequisites to find a solution. Who is going to represent the Palestinians, for instance? Who is the subject here? Who will negotiate and will make a bold approach? Even something similar to the incomplete approach that took place between Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat in the past. There is nobody here. What about Israel? Israel, which we support. We have an empathy with Israel. We are partners with Israel. Always in the framework of international law and in the framework of the boundaries of humanitarian laws. It is a country that right now has a serious internal problem, a clash, a division in Israel. There is a problem of legitimization of the government. There is a problem of constitutional order, which I observe professionally for the last 1 year and a half. It is of huge theoretic interest. Let us not forget that it is a country that, yes, it echoes Western values when it comes to democracy and human rights, but it is a religious state. It is a Hebrew state. This is its self-determination in the main law, because there is no integral constitution in Israel. There is a batch of main laws. So we all understand that there is a problem of subjects who could play a key role. Right now, the only subject that takes initiative and acts is the USA, of course. I believe that the USA, and this is my scenario, the USA act because President Biden, and in my view, he is a very important president when it comes to foreign policy. Possibly, he could be compared to Lyndon Johnson, who lived under the shadow of JFK. Perhaps President Biden is under the shadow of President Obama, let's say. And there is also the clash with Trump. But he is taking initiatives that do create some status quo that cannot be reversed by a subsequent administration in the USA. This is taking place in a systematic way, but you see that the Congress reacts to that. There is a Republican Party that does not want to further finance Ukraine, the Ukrainian war, and there are reactions in the Democratic Party vis-à-vis the situation in the Middle East.
One last comment about the foreign affairs in Turkey. There were two things very interesting by Mr. Gerapetritis. There is 10 months now of complete calmness in Greek-Turkey relationships, which we haven't lived since the 80s. We have no incidents over the Aegean. Can this be maintained without taking the next step? And the second thing, which is also optimistic, from Mrs. Papadopoulou, if I recall correctly, she said that the crisis in the Middle East, can it affect negatively this momentum of peace in our relationships? And she said that it can be positive. And let me give you a third angle on that. The Greek Prime Minister had a phone call with the President regarding the situation in the Middle East. We might follow a different rhetoric, but the fact that the two leaders talked on the phone for this subject and not for the Greek-Turkish relationships is very important, in my opinion. Allow me to say that I agree with Mrs. Papadopoulou that this crisis in the Middle East might prove to be positive for us as a momentum for the Greek-Turkish dialogue. We need to interpret things in a historic way, with a greater historic depth, what is being said in Turkey. We should not use newsroom criteria, let's say, and we need to insist with the dialogue, with the agenda as planned. And of course, it is of the utmost importance, in my opinion, that the American Minister of Foreign Affairs went to Ankara and talked with his counterpart, not the President Erdogan, but his counterpart. Maybe there was no result or nothing to declare, but it was a part of the visits that took place. And so we were good to do this phone call with the president. So I also agree that we have this moratorium these last 10 months. Now, if you want to talk about the history of this rolling moratorium after the Protocol of Bern, after the Yilmaz Memorandum, after all the measures taken to build trust, I would tell you that yes, there is a history, and this should make us wonder that we could do it in the past, so we can do it now. Maybe we could have done it earlier. It wasn't difficult. It was easier than we thought. And we can maintain it as well. But if we say that this is enough for us, it will shatter. Yes, I think that this is the key to all of that. So let's go back to the beginning of this conference. We started with a very interesting research from meta-analysis. What I'm trying to say, which I remember from being the most important thing of this research, actually two things. The realization of asymmetry. We have a political system that has one political party in 42%, three political parties between 10 and 14%, and a plethora of little small political parties, either left or right of the political mainstream. So this means that we have political parties that cannot play the role of the opposition. And the public opinion also realized that other institutions have atrophied right now and cannot keep the balance. So we have this asymmetry that is becoming an imbalance. It's easy to realize that, but how can we remedy that? Well, it's difficult to find a historical period without asymmetries, countries without asymmetries. We should take a look at our own affairs, of course. Also, there is asymmetry in the political system because this government has, of course, a victory in the elections, seems to lose points in legitimization the months that have followed after the election. And oftentimes this government bases itself on the electoral victory, while it should base itself on its daily victories and not the 41%. And we have an opposition that is in very low standing right now. I said, and it was considered by some as a doubt of the opposition. Of course, I do not doubt the opposition or the political parties in the opposition. But within this institutional framework of the majority of the electoral,
in the enhanced majority, bonusing the first party, it's very hard to create a counterbalance because the counterbalance of the opposition should be able to say that I claim in a serious way an autonomous majority based on one political party. So right now we have two formations in the opposition, PASOK and Syriza, and both of them should state a proposition of autonomous government based on one party. Otherwise, we can go into a logic of partnership in government within the constitutional sphere, of course. It is obvious, to put it bluntly, that we are in an in-between phase right now, which will last until the European elections. And this phase is about the inevitable competition between PASOK and Syriza about which political party is going to rank second. And, moreover, it will be the true opposition, regardless of what the parliament regulation stipulates. If in 2012 PASOK was second and not third, that in May of 2012 PASOK could be second and even first. You know what? because the percentages were 13.2 for PASOK, 16.2% for Syriza, and 19.2% for Nea Demokratia, or New Democracy. So the gap between PASOK and New Democracy was 6 points. That is, it can be breached in 3 points. Then the whole development would be very different. Anyway, PASOK historically has the right, after what has happened throughout crisis and subsequently, to talk about one objective for PASOK to be the second political party. And Syriza has also the right, in the framework of pluralism, to say that I rank second, I want to stay as a second political party. We shall see. We shall see. I believe that until we record the percentages of the European elections, it's very difficult to talk about any other maneuvers or developments. But the word wants an opposition that will be operational as a true counterbalance within the political sphere. But it also takes institutional counterbalances, that is, independent authorities, justice, related to the rule of law, and of course, people want some institutional prerequisites or political prerequisites, and they need reforms wherever needed, wherever they can be adopted. And let me tell you something else. You must be willing to undertake the cost. Apologies for being so long. I have undertaken, under very difficult conditions, the huge burden of announcing the doubling of the limit to be taxed. I have undertaken the cost to impose the special levy of surfaces electrified that exists until today, but they charged me with that. I did not decide it. The cabinet decided about it, but I announced it as a Minister of Finance 1 hour before the interview of the Prime Minister back then in the TIF, in the Thessaloniki Fair, because the Prime Minister asked me to announce that in order to avoid the burden of this announcement. And I did so because I did not have the luxury to be protected in terms of communication. Now, the debate about whether the taxable of freelancer would be 9.8 thousand euros or 10.8 thousand euros, personally, it seems something that it is not that important, because I didn't have that possibility to make any other selection. If you're not willing to undertake the political cost, then you can do nothing. Whoever is not willing to undertake the political cost, never and about anything, is a populist. What we are lacking in our country is a political party as a collective subject that will be progressive, protector and guarantor of the rule of law and rights, that has a specific vision, which is inclusiveness, cohesion, justice, the upgrade of the rule of law, a Greece, a country that will be competitive, developed, modern, and well reformed. But we must get rid of populists. That is, we are undertaking the risk of proposals tabled. In other words, not what I said the other day, we must not declare that I am a very big leader, I'm obliged to follow my funds. No. That's it, period. At the trigger of the 3-day meeting, the research that was the trigger for our discussions, in my view, had these 3 very interesting findings, very important ones. First, what we discussed, that for the first time, the Hellenic society is quite boldly, quite generously taking a stance when it comes to its aspirations on the Greek-Turkish relationship after 3 years of crisis. There were months that were quite threatening, and after 10 months' time of recession, we want to embed rather these calm waters. Second finding, what we talked about now, that is this intolerance when it comes to the shortage of counterbalance. I was impressed that independent authorities rank first in terms of trust, in terms of whom the public opinion trusts to play a pivotal role in our democracy. I think that we cannot put it in doubt. And the third finding is that in the question that was raised by Stratos, what are we, was the question. Are we radicals? We want a radical change. Are we conservatives? No change at all. Or are we reformists? We need steady democratic reforms. This election, we want reforms 65, radical 17, and conservative 16%. A very impressive percentage, even as a statement of identity. I don't know how should I put it, as Mr. Timas. You already talked about it. This was perceived as the following: we are ready and willing to accept reforms. Where the truth lies? Well, I clarified that since Sunday. You said that the reply is about the trilemma. Do you need revolutionary changes? Do you need absolute inertia? Or do you need reforms? They said we need reforms. This does not mean that they accept all reforms, especially the reforms that pertain to each individual and each professional group. Each one means totally different things. By giving that reply, using the notion of reform, apart from Mr. Meimaroglu, who means his own magazine as a reform. Everybody else is talking about different things. This is tested in the field, but you must have a very holistic approach. Reform in the health system, for instance, what would that be? Is it about the personal doctor as announced? No, this is no reform. Is it about any other hospital-oriented model? Perhaps. Many things can be. If the logic prevails that we must abolish small hospitals and have big regional hospitals, will there be the consensus by local societies? That is, abolish the 4 hospitals in Lasith region, Iritizi, the 2 hospitals in Kozani region, or the 2 hospitals in Pella region, Iritizi, when the distance from the big university hospitals is less than 50 kilometers and difficult situations, difficult cases are transferred to the university hospitals? Non-state universities. Yes, I have said that it is a fight of the rear guard, Article 16, on the establishment of private universities. We must have a holistic law which starts from the liberalization of state universities, leading up to partnerships with foreign universities and to non-governmental, non-state, non-public universities abiding by certain prerequisites, by certain standards that should be met by all regional public universities, because you cannot ask for standards by the non-state ones that are not met by the regional state universities, and vice versa. So many things can be supported and strengthened. Am I right? The issue is who has the possibility to support both? Who has the possibility on the same night to go to the event for Kostas Simitis and to the event for Margareta Giannakou Koutsikou? This was done by the Prime Minister, and quite rightly, I should say. But I need an opposition that, apologies, yes, it would be better to tell the organizers of the one event or the second event, can we put it tomorrow? Yes, okay. This is a topic of understanding and organizational nature. Let's say that it happens. The opposition should do the same. They should be able to go to both events equally well and in the same convenience, without any bias, without any complex of ideological purity. Here we had the reverse phenomenon, that the participation in an event was announced and then there was the denunciation of the honored people in this event as a person who went against the public sphere. This means that this version of the opposition is doomed to reach a dead end. The other version, though, that should be more agile, that is the one having a vision and an inclusive identity, which is found in PASOK, because as Kostas Simitis said yesterday, and I'm saying so that as well, because in our politics, in our ideas, we're all aligned after 2011 and since 2015, and Syriza itself, after July 2015, echoed our own political ideas. So we must not have this type of problems in PASOK. Even myself, if I could, I would visit both events, the one of Margareta Giannakou and the one for Kostas Simitis. Petros Efthymiou delivered a speech, who was a pivotal minister of the Simitis administration, but personally, many times I got an honorary invitation by the Konstantinos Karamanlis Foundation to deliver a speech about Konstantinos Karamanlis, and I did so quite willingly. As I have talked about Konstantinos Mitsotakis, of course, for all historic figures of our own political history, no matter what our trigger point is. Well, when it comes to the management of history and symbols, there we can find the solution for a whole perception through which you can build the alternative idea, this counterbalance. This is related to the management of symbols. I remember a historic pre-electoral ad of PASOK starting from Pericles, ending up to today. Art-wise, it was a very good ad in terms of aesthetics that dealt with historic symbols for electoral purpose, of course. But it delivered. It delivered back then. It could be more generous now. Okay, it would be difficult not to be crushed in the selection between Alexandros Mavrokordatos and Ioannis Kapodistrias. But if we manage, if we go through these dire straits, we can deliver quite well in the inclusive management of symbols of the Greek political and ideological history, because both are interlinked. Thank you so much. Thank you, President. Thank you. See you next year. Thank you. Enjoy the night. Thank you.